In the quiet corners of the world, where the shadows of ancient power still linger, a new leader rises from the ashes of the past. Will they break free from the weight of history? Or will the dragon's legacy consume them just as it did those before? Wei Chao stepped off the ferry into the soft mist of Hong Kong's harbor, his silhouette just a shadow beneath the rising sun. The city, a sprawling jungle of neon lights and skyscrapers, had changed in the years he'd been gone, but it still held the same dangerous pulse. It beat in the alleyways, in the eyes of the men and women who walked with their heads down, who knew the price of silence. Hong Kong had a rhythm to it, one that belonged to the Triads, the ancient dragons that ruled the underworld, the tattooed men who wore the dragon as a symbol of power. The old legends told of the dragons who were protectors once, warriors for the people. Now, they were something else entirely, tyrants, controlling the underbelly of the city with iron fists and fear. For every inch of the skyline, there was a mile of shadow where they moved unseen, their influence touching every corner of the city. The police knew better than to ask questions. Politicians? Bought. Journalists? Silenced. Wei had been part of that world once. He had watched as his family, respected and untouchable, was brought to its knees by the very men he had called allies. The Triads had shown no mercy. His father, a man who had made his mark through cunning and honor, had been taken from him in the cruelest way. They wanted control of his territory, his business, his soul. And when they were finished with him, they made sure Wei was left with nothing but dust and broken promises. For years, he had stayed away, hidden in the shadows, waiting, learning, plotting. He had become something else, a ghost in the world, waiting for the day when he would return. When the time was right, when the dragons had weakened just enough, when their arrogance made them blind, he was no longer the boy who had once sat at the table of power. He was something darker now, a man forged in the fire of vengeance. Hong Kong was still alive with the hum of old power, but Wei knew that everything had its time, even dragons. He hadn't come back to just watch from the sidelines. No, he had come for them, to make them remember who they had buried, to make them feel what it was like to lose everything. In the streets, the whispers started before he even took a step. Wei Chao. The name floated on the air like a forgotten legend, a specter from a past that the Triads had long since tried to erase. But they couldn't erase him, not when the ghosts of his family were still tied to every corner of this city, not when he wore the dragon's mark too, hidden beneath his sleeve. Waiting to unleash the storm, Wei sat in the dimly lit back room of a restaurant, the air thick with smoke and the distant clinking of glasses from the front. A low hum of chatter filled the space, but here, in the shadows, silence reigned. His contact, a wiry man with a face carved from years of street deals and secrets, slid a battered envelope across the table. The paper was old, yellowed, the ink fading but still legible. The Triads didn't just rise from the streets, the man whispered, his eyes darting around to ensure no one was listening. They were born from the oldest myths. You know, the dragons, the ones your father spoke of long ago. Wei didn't flinch. He had been waiting for this. He had heard the stories about the ancient connection between the Triads and the dragons that once ruled China, but he had never understood the full weight of them until now. The way the power had seeped into their veins, how the Triads had not just inherited the symbol, but the very essence of it, the belief that they were invincible, untouchable, destined to rule. They say the dragons were protectors, the man continued, his voice a rasp. But no one talks about what happened when they turned their claws inward, when they stopped protecting and started devouring everything in their path. Your family, Wei, they didn't just fall because of some petty betrayal. The Triads made sure of it. They had the dragon's blessing, a pact older than the city itself. Wei's grip tightened around the envelope, the weight of the man's words sinking in like cold stone. He had thought it was just about power, greed, perhaps. But this was more. The Triads had woven themselves into the very fabric of history, tied to forces that transcended mere men. They were gods in their own right, controlling the city through the myths they manipulated, creating an empire that stretched back centuries. Why now? Wei asked, his voice a low growl. Why did they let me survive? If they had so much power, why didn't they kill me too? The man's eyes darkened, and he leaned in closer. Because they knew you'd come back. You were never meant to die. Your blood is tied to theirs, to the dragons. They made sure of it. And now that you're back, the balance is tipping Wei. The dragons are restless. The empire they built is cracking at the edges. They can feel it. They know you'll tear it down. Wei's heart thudded in his chest, the cold realization washing over him. The battle ahead wasn't just about taking down the Triads. It was about ending something far older, far darker than he could have ever imagined. The Triads were not just men, they were a force born from the very myths that had shaped China for thousands of years. And now, the dragons had awakened. The memory struck Wei like a fist to the chest. He had tried to bury it, to let time dull the edges. But every step he took in Hong Kong unearthed the ghosts of his past. And tonight, standing on the edge of the city, the wounds felt fresh again. It was a stormy night, years ago, when everything had begun to unravel. Wei Chao, then a young man brimming with ambition, had sat at the family table, his father across from him, the smell of incense and roasting pork filling the air. The family was strong then, respected. His father, Chao Wen, had commanded the city's underworld with a quiet strength that even the Triads had feared. But there was one thing he hadn't accounted for: greed. The night had started like any other. The Triads had invited his father to a gathering, a simple meeting, they had said. Business, nothing more, they promised. But Wei had felt the unease in the air, a tension that clung to every word spoken. He had been too young to fully understand the politics, the silent deals made behind closed doors. But he could see the shift in his father's eyes. Chao Wen, always calm, always in control, had grown restless that night. Wei had watched from the shadows as his father spoke with Li Shun, the head of the Triads at the time, a man whose smile never quite reached his eyes. They had spoken in hushed tones, exchanging glances that Wei now understood all too well. Betrayal was in the air, thick like smoke. His father had known it too, but he had been too proud to acknowledge the truth until it was too late. By dawn, the family was dead. Chao Wen lay in the streets, his body riddled with bullets, a gun still clenched in his hand. The Triads had made sure his father's death was public, that the message would reach every corner of the city. To challenge them was to invite ruin, but it was the quiet ones who suffered the most. Wei's mother, his sisters gone in a heartbeat, buried beneath the rubble of their once thriving business. He had been the only one spared, hiding in the shadows, a spectator to the destruction of everything he had ever known. That night, as he crouched in the darkness, the distant wail of sirens echoing through the streets, something in him had snapped. The anger, the helplessness, the despair, it all fused together into one thing: a burning need for revenge. I will make them pay, Wei had whispered to himself, though he knew deep down that it wouldn't be as simple as a bullet in the head. The Triads had stolen everything from him, not just his family, but his life, his future. They had thought they could crush him, but they had underestimated the fury of a man with nothing left to lose. Now, all these years later, standing at the precipice of his vengeance, Wei felt that same fire rekindle. The Triads had thought him dead, but they had forgotten one thing: the heart of a dragon, once awakened, never sleeps. The casino was a fortress hidden in plain sight, tucked away in the shadows of Hong Kong's glitzy skyline. The soft hum of slot machines, mixed with the low murmur of high-stakes gamblers, all wrapped in velvet and silk. But beneath the opulence, the air felt thick, charged with danger. Wei stepped inside, his eyes scanning the room, his every sense alert. This wasn't just a place of games. This was the heart of the Triads' power, a labyrinth of deals, debts, and whispers. Wei had been planning this night for months. Lao Ming, the Triad leader who ran the casino, was infamous for his cold brutality. His reputation spread like wildfire, a man feared even among his own. They said his hand was always on the pulse of the city's darkest dealings, his fingers pulling the strings that controlled everything from illegal trade to political influence. If Wei was going to find a way to dismantle the Triads from the inside, he had to go through Lao Ming. The entrance was a haze of cigarette smoke, dim lights casting long shadows over marble floors. Wei moved with purpose, blending into the crowd, his presence barely noticeable, his every step calculated. The air smelled of expensive perfume and the distant scent of alcohol. A place where fortunes were won and lost, but also a place where no one was ever truly safe. He made his way to the back of the casino, past the poker tables and baccarat dealers, to a private room where Lao Ming was known to hold court. A few men stood at the door, their eyes watching anyone who approached, their hands resting casually on the hilts of knives and guns. Wei flashed a smile, pretending to be just another wealthy gambler, and slipped inside. Lao Ming sat at the head of the table, his face unreadable, his eyes like steel. He didn't smile when he saw Wei, didn't even acknowledge his presence at first, but Wei had no choice but to walk up to him, to let the game unfold. "I know who you are," Lao Ming said finally, his voice cold, measured. "Wei Chao, the prodigal son of a dead empire." Wei's pulse quickened. He hadn't expected Lao Ming to be so aware of his presence, but then again, nothing in this city moved without the Triads knowing about it. He offered a small bow, a gesture of respect, though he felt none of it. "I'm here to play," Wei said smoothly, his voice laced with hidden intent. "I hear you have the best games in town." Lao Ming studied him, as if deciding whether to trust this stranger or kill him where he stood. Then, with a nod, he gestured for Wei to sit at the table. The cards were dealt, the dice thrown, but the game was never really about luck. It was about testing the waters, gathering information, feeling the undercurrents of power that swirled beneath every move. Wei learned more in those few minutes than he had in years. Lao Ming was indeed the puppet master of the Triads, but he had rivals, cracks in his empire that Wei could exploit. But as the game reached its peak, something shifted. Wei could feel it in the air, something wasn't right. He made his move, rising from the table just a little too abruptly. A dozen hands shot out to grab him, but he was already gone, slipping into the shadows of the casino, heart racing. They knew him now. He had revealed himself. The Triads were hunting him, and he barely made it out with his life. The escape was a blur, running through the back corridors, pushing through staff doors, and darting into the alleyways of the city. His breath came in ragged gasps, but his mind was clear. He had what he needed, and though the danger had nearly cost him everything, Wei knew the game was far from over. The first pieces had fallen into place. The Triads' empire was crumbling. Wei sat in the quiet of his safe house, the only light coming from the flickering glow of his laptop screen. He had gathered enough intel to make his next move, but there was one thing that continued to elude him: the tattoos. Every Triad leader, every key figure he had encountered, wore the same mark, a dragon, intricately inked into their skin. To the untrained eye, it might seem like mere decoration, but Wei knew better. The tattoos were not just symbols. They were the very foundation of the Triads' power, each one a key to understanding the hierarchy, the loyalty, and the deadly secrets of the organization. He leaned closer to the screen, his fingers typing in the search terms that would pull the threads of history into the present. The more he dug, the more he uncovered. The tattoos, it seemed, were as old as the Triads themselves. It wasn't just a mark of affiliation, it was a mark of blood, a symbol that connected the wearers to something ancient, something that predated the streets of Hong Kong and reached back into the myth and legend of China itself. The first dragon tattoo, Wei learned, had been inked centuries ago, during the time of the first secret societies, long before the Triads became the criminal empire they were today. The dragons, it was said, were the protectors of the land, fierce and untamable, embodiments of strength and wisdom. But over time, as the Triads grew in power and influence, the meaning of the tattoo twisted. It no longer represented protection but dominion, control, and vengeance. Wei's eyes narrowed as he read further. Each dragon tattoo was unique, representing the personal traits and qualities of the individual who wore it. The intricate scales, the claws, the eyes, they were all symbols of the leader's authority, their dominance over the criminal underworld. But there was more. Some dragons bore markings that identified them as part of specific factions within the Triads, their allegiance clear in the way the dragon's tail curved or the way its wings were spread. It was a map, a code that could unravel the entire organization if understood correctly. The tattoos weren't just a badge of honor. They were a warning. They marked the wearer as someone who could command life and death with a single word. Each dragon had its own story, its own history, etched in ink, and Wei understood now that the Triads' power wasn't just in the drugs or the money, it was in the symbols that bound them all together. A mark that, once earned, could never be erased. It was a lineage, a bloodline, passed down from leader to leader. Wei leaned back in his chair, the weight of his discovery settling in. The dragons weren't just figures of mythology or design. They were the beating hearts of the Triads. If he wanted to destroy them, he had to understand not just their criminal empire, but the mythology that sustained it. The dragons had been alive long before the streets of Hong Kong were stained with blood. And if Wei was going to take down the Triads, he would need to learn to speak their language, to read the tattoos, and to wield them as a weapon. With a grim determination, Wei set his mind to the task. The game had just changed, and now he was no longer just hunting men, he was hunting dragons. Wei stood in the dimly lit alley, his breath misting in the cool night air as he waited. The sounds of the city, distant traffic, the occasional shout from the market nearby felt distant, muted. His mind was elsewhere, focused on the woman he was about to meet, Mei Ling, a name that stirred something in him, both regret and nostalgia. Years had passed since they last crossed paths, but there was no mistaking the pull of the past. Mei Ling had always been a woman of incredible strength, both in heart and in mind. She had risen through the ranks of a rival gang, with a speed that left even the Triads in awe. But her journey hadn't been easy, and Wei knew the cost of her success. She was no longer the carefree woman he had once known. She had become something else, a force in her own right, dangerous, cold, and determined. But there was still a spark of the Mei Ling he remembered. Wei could see it in the way she looked at him, the flicker of recognition hidden behind the walls she had built around herself. When she emerged from the shadows, her movements were as graceful as ever, her sharp eyes scanning the alley for danger before she approached. She wore a sleek black leather jacket, her hair pulled back into a tight bun, the perfect image of power and control. But there was a tiredness in her eyes that Wei hadn't seen before, a weight she carried with her, one that made her look older than she was. "You've come back," Mei Ling said, her voice cool, but not without an edge of something softer beneath the surface. "I thought you were dead," Wei smirked, a hint of bitterness curling at the edges of his lips. "You thought I was dead, or you hoped I was." She didn't flinch, but he saw the brief flicker of emotion pass through her eyes, something between regret and sorrow. The years had changed them both, but they hadn't erased everything. "I didn't expect you to come to me for help, Wei," she continued, her voice softer now. You know how dangerous it is. He nodded, understanding the risks. Mei Ling had earned her position, but it had come at the cost of alliances. Helping Wei would mean putting herself at odds with the Triads, with everything she had built. But Wei wasn't here to ask for her mercy. He was here because she was one of the few people he trusted, and more than that, she was one of the few who understood the deep currents of loyalty and betrayal that ran through the underworld. I'm not asking for your forgiveness, Mei. I'm asking for your help, Wei said, his tone serious now. I've learned things. The Triads, their tattoos, their power. I need to take them down, but I can't do it alone. There was a long silence. Mei Ling studied him, weighing his words. Then, after a pause that seemed to stretch on forever, she spoke. I'm in, she said, her voice steady. But you know what this means. If I help you, we both die. Wei met her gaze, a fire igniting in his chest. Then let's die fighting. Mei Ling's lips curled into a faint smile, the first real expression of warmth she had shown. You haven't changed. Wei smiled back. Neither have you. And just like that, the past was resurrected. They had once been lovers, but now they were allies, bound by something darker and far more dangerous than love. Together, they would face the Triads, and whatever lay ahead, they would face it side by side. Wei moved through the shadows of the docks, the acrid scent of salt water mixing with the faint odor of gasoline. It was late, too late for most, but for those who operated on the margins of the law, it was just the beginning. The sprawling complex of warehouses was a hive of activity, and Wei knew the Triads had set up shop here. Their smuggling operations spread across the globe, from counterfeit goods to firearms, drugs to artifacts stolen from ancient tombs. This was the lifeblood of their empire, and tonight, Wei was going to disrupt it. He had spent days tracking shipments, following the flow of illegal goods from one location to another. The network was vast, but every operation had its weak link. Wei's contacts had provided him with the coordinates for the next big shipment, a batch of firearms, being delivered under the cover of night. He'd learned enough about the Triads' methods to know that they would be using the docks as a drop-off point, but what he hadn't counted on was how tightly the operation was guarded. As he neared the shipping yard, his heart rate quickened, but he kept his breath steady, his body low, moving like a shadow between crates and rusted metal. The lights flickered in the distance, casting long, exaggerated shadows across the dock. There were several men posted around the perimeter, all armed, all alert. He had to be careful, or the entire operation would come crashing down before he even had a chance to get inside. Wei crouched beside a stack of shipping containers, adjusting his gloves. The plan was simple: find the shipment, gather intel, and disappear before anyone noticed he was there. He could take out the guards if necessary, but his priority was the intel. The fewer bodies left behind, the better. He peered around the corner of a nearby crate, scanning the area. 3 men were unloading the weapons from a truck, loading them into a larger shipping container. Wei could hear the clinking of metal, the low murmur of the men's voices, but the night was still, too still. He pulled his phone from his jacket and snapped a quick picture of the shipment's serial numbers, then slipped it back into his pocket. This would be enough. With luck, this intel would give him the leverage he needed to make his next move against the Triads. As Wei began to move closer, the sound of a car engine revved in the distance. He froze. It was too late to back out now. He couldn't risk being seen, not with the shipment so close. He crept forward, but just as he reached the corner of the container, a pair of headlights swung into view. The men guarding the operation were no longer the only danger. Wei's time had run out. A figure emerged from the shadows, and the sound of a heavy boot hitting concrete echoed across the yard. It was Lao Ming, one of the Triad's most ruthless leaders, accompanied by several of his bodyguards. The situation had gone from covert to chaotic in seconds. Wei's pulse raced, but his mind was already calculating his next move. With Lao Ming here, things were about to get bloody. But Wei was prepared for this. He'd fought for survival before. Tonight, he would fight again this time, for revenge. Wei's investigation had taken him into places darker than he had anticipated. As he dug deeper into the Triads' operations, the surface corruption gave way to something far more sinister. The further he ventured, the more he realized that the Triads' power was not merely the product of illicit business dealings and ruthless violence. Beneath it all, something older, something mystical, lay at the core of their strength. It was through Mei Ling's network that he learned of the ancient rituals the Triads performed to maintain their dominance. In whispers shared under breath and cloaked in secrecy, Wei pieced together stories of the dragon's power, a hidden legacy that went beyond mere tradition, one that was linked to an artifact of unimaginable power. The Triads, it seemed, were not just a criminal syndicate. They were the stewards of something far more dangerous, tied to the ancient myths of China. Wei had heard rumors, of course, of the sacred stone that was said to be the heart of the Triads' power, but he hadn't believed them. He thought it was just folklore, a myth to keep the underlings in awe. But the closer he came to the top echelons of the organization, the more he realized that the legends had a basis in reality. One night, Mei Ling reached out to him with urgent news. She had secured a meeting with an elder who had been involved in the most secretive parts of the Triads' operations. The elder had once been a high-ranking member but had defected when the ancient rituals became too much for him to bear. Now, hiding in the backstreets of Kowloon, he was willing to reveal the truth if Wei could find him. The old man spoke of the dragon's stone, a relic said to have been passed down through generations of Triad leaders. The stone, shaped like a dragon's fang, was rumored to grant immense strength to whoever controlled it. But the price for that power was steep. The stone was not simply a tool, it was a curse, bound to ancient blood rituals that demanded sacrifice. Every time the stone was used, the user's life force was slowly drained, their soul tethered to the dragon's curse. The more the Triads used the stone, the more their power grew, but so did their debt to the ancient spirits it housed. Wei's mind raced. The Triads had been using this stone for centuries, keeping it hidden in plain sight, with only the highest members aware of its existence. The knowledge was locked away in an ancient temple, a place deep in the mountains where no outsider had ever dared venture. But Wei had no choice now. The Triad's strength lay not in weapons or money, but in something far older, something that Wei was determined to destroy. He wasn't just taking on the Triads anymore. He was confronting the very myths that had made them legends. And this time, he wouldn't stop until the dragon was slain. Wei stood at the edge of the dimly lit room, his eyes tracing the intricate dragon tattoo on Lao Ming's back. He had seen the symbol many times before, but tonight, under the flickering light of a single lantern, it seemed to pulse with a hidden energy. The tattoo was not just a mark of power, it was something more, something far older. Lao Ming had always been a mystery, a shadow that moved within the Triad's most sacred circles. But now, Wei knew there was a secret beneath the inked dragon that could unravel everything. It wasn't just about status, it was about a treasure, a lost relic tied to the myths of the ancient world. Wei's eyes narrowed as he approached Lao Ming's private quarters, the heavy scent of incense mixing with the musty air. The leader's movements were slow, deliberate, almost ceremonial, as if he knew someone was watching, waiting. Lao Ming's dragon tattoo had always been rumored to be more than just a symbol of dominance. It was a legend that spoke of immortality, of an ancient treasure buried deep within the mountains of China, hidden from the world for centuries. The Triads, it seemed, had not just been building their empire, they had been safeguarding something far more valuable. As Wei dug deeper into the Triads' history, he uncovered pieces of a puzzle that began to fit together. The treasure the Triads sought wasn't just gold or jewels, but an artifact so powerful that it was said to grant immortality. The tattoo that adorned Lao Ming's skin wasn't a simple design. It was a map, a key to the treasure's location, hidden in plain sight. Every curve, every line on the tattoo was a marker, a direction that led to the heart of the Triads' most dangerous secrets. Wei had suspected that Lao Ming's ruthless demeanor was driven by something deeper than power. The Triad leader was no longer just a criminal. He was a man obsessed with achieving eternal life. Wei's heart raced as he realized the true extent of the Triads' ambitions. They had been using their underworld empire to fund a search for immortality, willing to sacrifice anything and anyone in their pursuit of it. With the tattoo as his guide, Lao Ming had been drawing closer to the treasure for years, using the Triads' vast network to uncover clues, remove obstacles, and eliminate anyone who stood in his way. Wei knew that the Triads were dangerous, but this was something else entirely. Lao Ming wasn't just a leader. He was a man driven by an ancient thirst for something far beyond mortal reach. The weight of the discovery settled over Wei like a shroud. If the Triads found the treasure, they would become untouchable, unstoppable. He had thought the battle was about revenge, but now it was about something far greater, stopping a dangerous, ancient myth from becoming a terrifying reality. Wei had felt the pressure building for days, an invisible weight pressing down on him as the Triads tightened their grip around Hong Kong. His every move had been watched, scrutinized by Lao Ming's most trusted men. Wei had known it was only a matter of time before Lao Ming struck back, but he hadn't anticipated the ferocity of the retaliation. It started with whispers. Small rumors passed through the streets like wildfire. Lao Ming was angry. No, he was livid. Wei had crossed a line, uncovered secrets he wasn't meant to know. The Triads were a well-oiled machine, but even machines had their breaking points. Wei had struck at the heart of their power, and now there would be consequences. He was waiting in a low-lit warehouse on the outskirts of Kowloon when the attack came. The door slammed open with brutal force, and before Wei could react, the first wave of men poured into the room. They were masked, their movements calculated, their presence suffocating. It was a hit, but it was no ordinary hit. This was a statement. Wei didn't flinch. He had been expecting it. What he hadn't expected was Mei Ling's sudden appearance, her silhouette cutting through the haze of smoke and dust. Behind her, a group of mercenaries, all well-armed, materialized from the shadows, their weapons ready. The mercenaries had been her network, hired muscle she trusted more than the Triads' own men. "Move," Mei Ling shouted, her voice a sharp command that broke the tension in the air. The mercenaries sprang into action, a deadly dance of gunfire and movement. Wei ducked behind a crate, his instincts kicking in. The sound of gunfire was deafening, but it was also strangely comforting. He had trained for this. He had prepared for this moment. The Triad men, heavily armed and confident in their numbers, were thrown off balance by the unexpected resistance. The warehouse quickly transformed into a war zone, the air thick with the scent of gunpowder and the sharp crack of bullets. Mei Ling was a blur of motion, her grace and precision cutting down the attackers with ruthless efficiency. Wei watched, knowing that her allegiance to him had come with a price, one that she was now paying with her life. The mercenaries weren't just defending him, they were making a stand. As the last of the Triads' forces fell, the warehouse fell silent, save for the echoes of the fight. Wei emerged from behind the crate, his breath heavy, his heart pounding. Mei Ling stood amidst the chaos, her face unreadable. "That was close," she said, wiping the blood from her cheek. Wei nodded, his thoughts already turning. Lao Ming would not let this go. The Triads had sent their best to kill him, but he had survived. And now, more than ever, he realized that he was no longer just a man out for revenge. He was the target of a war that was only beginning to heat up. The wind howled across Dragon's Hill, carrying with it a sense of impending doom. Wei stood at the summit, his eyes scanning the darkened horizon. The hill was silent now, but the legends spoke of a different time, a time when the first Triad leaders swore oaths of power and blood on this very ground. Tonight, the hill would once again bear witness to a battle of legends, one that would determine the fate of Wei and the Triads. The Triads were coming. Wei could feel it in his bones, the tension thick in the air, as if the land itself knew what was about to unfold. Lao Ming, desperate to crush the threat Wei had become, had gathered his forces for this final confrontation. They had tracked him here, to the heart of the Triads' ancient legacy, where the battle would be fought in the shadows of history. Mei Ling stood beside him, her face grim but resolute. The mercenaries had spread out, taking their positions among the rocks and trees, ready to face the incoming storm. It was a strange alliance, one born of necessity and survival, but it had proven to be stronger than Wei had anticipated. Together, they had become a formidable force, one that would make Lao Ming regret underestimating them. Wei's hand rested on the hilt of his knife, his senses sharp. The sound of boots crunching on the gravel reached his ears, and he knew the Triads were closing in. A shout echoed from the valley below, the first sign of the chaos to come. Then, without warning, the darkness exploded into violence. Gunfire rang out, cutting through the night like thunder. The mercenaries responded immediately, their rifles echoing in sharp retaliation. Wei darted forward, his movements fluid, a blur in the shadows. He could see the Triads now, their faces painted with determination, their weapons gleaming in the moonlight. They had come to win, to crush him once and for all. The battle raged across the hilltop, men falling like leaves in the wind. Wei fought with a singular purpose, his every move guided by years of rage and loss. Lao Ming's men were ruthless, but Wei's group was driven by something far stronger, a need for justice, for redemption, and for revenge. Mei Ling was a force of nature, cutting through the Triad ranks with surgical precision. Her movements were lethal, her focus unbreakable. As the battle escalated, Wei found himself face to face with Lao Ming. The Triad leader's eyes burned with fury, his dragon tattoo standing out against his sweat-drenched skin. This was the moment he had been waiting for. "You think you can take everything from me, Wei?" Lao Ming spat, his voice laced with venom. Wei's eyes met his, steady and cold. "I'm taking back what you stole." With a roar, Lao Ming lunged, but Wei was ready. The two clashed, their knives meeting in a flurry of sparks and blood. The hill trembled beneath their fight, the ancient stones bearing witness to a battle for power that had spanned generations. In the end, it was Wei who emerged victorious, his knife plunging deep into Lao Ming's chest. The Triad leader's body crumpled to the ground, and with him, the myth of the Dragon's Hill was finally laid to rest. The battlefield fell silent as Wei stood over the man who had brought so much destruction. His breath came heavy, his heart still racing, but for the first time in years, he felt the weight of his past begin to lift. The winds had shifted by the time Wei reached the ancient temple at the foot of the mountain, where the final remnants of the old Triad Empire were buried. His footsteps were silent, but his heart thudded in his chest, as if it could be heard for miles. The temple, hidden deep within the heart of the mountain, had stood for centuries, its secrets sealed by time and myth. Now, it called to him, pulling him toward something he had been searching for in his quest for vengeance, a weapon that had been lost to history. Inside the temple, the air was thick with dust and silence. Wei moved cautiously, his eyes scanning the dark, weathered walls adorned with ancient carvings that told stories of power and bloodshed. The Triads had once ruled with an iron grip, but this was their true legacy, the power they had drawn from the sword of the first emperor, a weapon not just forged in steel, but in the very essence of the Triads' ancient bloodline. The Sword of the Dragon, it was called, a blade that could cut through the darkness itself. Wei had heard whispers of its existence for years, legends passed down from the oldest members of the Triads. They spoke of its mystical properties, how the sword could grant its wielder strength beyond imagination, and with it, control over the fate of all who crossed its path. But such power came at a cost. The sword was said to choose its master, and only one who understood its true nature could wield it without succumbing to madness. As Wei moved deeper into the temple, he felt the weight of those old stories press down on him. His hand brushed against a stone altar, and his fingers traced the cold surface, feeling for any sign of the sword's presence. Then, hidden in the shadows, he saw it. The sword was encased in a glass-like shell, resting on a pedestal surrounded by forgotten relics. Its blade gleamed with an otherworldly light, the intricate dragon design on the hilt seeming to pulse with an energy all its own. Wei approached slowly, his heart racing as if the sword could sense his intentions. He reached out and, with a deep breath, lifted the blade from its resting place. The moment his fingers wrapped around the hilt, a jolt of power surged through him. The sword hummed, alive with ancient magic, and for a moment, Wei saw visions, flashes of the past, of emperors and warriors who had wielded this blade, and the blood they had spilled to claim their dominance. But before Wei could fully grasp the power now coursing through him, a voice echoed from the shadows. "You should have left it where it was, Wei Chao." Wei turned, the sword in his hand gleaming like a beacon. Lao Ming stepped into view, his eyes burning with hunger. The Triad leader had followed him here, driven by the same desire for power that had shaped his every move. Lao Ming's gaze fixed on the blade, his expression twisted with greed. "The sword belongs to the Triads, and it will be mine." Wei raised the sword, his grip firm. Not this time. The air crackled with tension. The sword's power was now his, but would it be enough to defeat the man who had brought him so much pain? Wei stood in the shadows, watching the night unfold around him. The city of Hong Kong hummed with the usual chaos, but tonight there was something different in the air, an electric current of anticipation. He had lured Lao Ming here, to this forgotten warehouse on the edge of the city, under the guise of an alliance. His plan was simple: feed the Triad leader enough lies to make him bite, then spring the trap. But Wei had learned one thing over the years: no matter how careful you were, the Triads always found a way to turn the tables. He took a deep breath, his mind sharp, despite the heavy weight of exhaustion from the battles he had fought. Lao Ming was coming, drawn by the promise of control over the Sword of the Dragon, an offer Wei had made, knowing full well it would be too tempting to resist. But in his haste, Wei had forgotten one crucial thing: the Triads never operated with honesty. They thrived on manipulation, on bending others to their will. And now, he was about to pay for underestimating that. The doors of the warehouse creaked open, and Wei's fingers tightened around the hilt of the sword. Lao Ming appeared, flanked by his loyal enforcers, their expressions cold and calculating. The leader's eyes gleamed with that same hunger Wei had seen so many times before. The man was a predator, always looking for the next kill. "I came as promised, Wei Chao," Lao Ming said, his voice smooth, but laced with a threat that lingered in the air like smoke. "But I don't see what you have to offer." Wei stepped out from the shadows, a smirk tugging at the corner of his lips. "It's all here," he said, motioning toward the shadows where a large crate lay waiting. "The sword, the power you seek, it's yours, if you're willing to pay the price." The words were a calculated risk. Wei had deliberately planted a fake crate, filled with empty boxes wrapped in layers of false promises. It was the perfect bait, exactly what Lao Ming wanted, and yet it contained nothing but air. Wei's plan was to lure him further into the trap, to push Lao Ming into a corner where he would be forced to make a choice: accept defeat or risk everything to claim what was never his. But as Lao Ming stepped closer to the crate, something shifted. Wei's gut twisted, a feeling deep in his core that something wasn't right. He had miscalculated. The moment Lao Ming's hand hovered over the crate, the sound of footsteps echoed from all directions. Wei's eyes widened in realization. The Triads weren't walking into a trap. They had been setting one of their own. He turned, adrenaline spiking, but it was too late. The doors to the warehouse slammed shut, locking him in. The flickering overhead lights dimmed, casting long shadows on the walls. The Triads had surrounded him. No escape. You thought you could play me, Wei? Lao Ming's voice echoed through the room, cold and filled with dark amusement. You're the one who's been trapped. Wei's heart pounded as he gripped the sword tighter. The battle was far from over, but this time, the enemy had the upper hand. The trap had been set, and now, it was his turn to survive. Wei's eyes darted across the room, searching for any possible means of escape. The Triad enforcers circled him like vultures, their weapons drawn, their faces grim and unreadable. But in the midst of the tension, there was one figure who stood apart from the others, Mei Ling. She watched the scene unfold, her gaze colder than usual, her lips pressed into a thin line. It was then that the realization struck him something about Mei Ling had always been off, a flicker of mystery that he had failed to decipher. For all their shared history, for all the times she had fought beside him, there was a truth she had hidden from him, and it was time he learned what it was. Mei Ling, Wei called, his voice a mixture of demand and curiosity. What's going on? Why are you standing there? Her eyes met his, and for a moment, Wei could see the conflict in them, the tightrope she was walking between two worlds. Slowly, she stepped forward, her movements graceful but purposeful. The Triads seemed to hold their breath, waiting for her next move. I'm not the person you think I am, Wei, she said, her voice softer than he expected, yet still laced with an undercurrent of something darker. I didn't come here just to help you. Wei's heart skipped a beat. What are you talking about? She took a deep breath, as if preparing herself to reveal something that had been buried for a long time. I'm not just another ally. I'm a descendant of the original Triad Dragon Kings. The blood runs through my veins, just like theirs. And my loyalty lies with the dragon. Wei's mind raced, trying to process her words. The Dragon Kings? He had always known the Triads were steeped in ancient legend, that their power was more than just muscle and money. But this was something he hadn't anticipated. Mei Ling, the woman he trusted more than anyone, the one who had fought by his side in the bloodiest of battles, was part of the very bloodline he sought to destroy. You, Wei's voice faltered. You're one of them? Mei Ling nodded, her expression unflinching. Not in the way you think. I've never fully embraced the Triad's ways, but my bloodline, it gives me a claim to power that you don't understand. The dragon has always been a symbol of dominance, and it's time that I claim my rightful place. Wei's mind reeled as he processed the betrayal, but then a deeper realization set in. Mei Ling wasn't just playing both sides. She had her own agenda, one that could very well change the course of everything he had fought for. In the end, it wasn't just about vengeance anymore. The power of the dragon was more than just a myth. It was a force that could tear everything apart. He stepped closer to her, his eyes narrowed. What do you want, Mei Ling? You've been playing a dangerous game. I want what was always mine, Wei, she said, her voice steady now, almost resigned. And if you're smart, you'll join me. Together, we can take the Triads down from the inside. Wei's grip tightened on the sword at his side. He had always believed that revenge was the only path to reclaiming his family's honor. But now, Mei Ling had offered him something else, a chance to rewrite the entire legacy of the Triads. The question was, could he trust her? The night was heavy with tension, as Wei sat across from Mei Ling in their secluded hideout. He had been cautiously weighing her words ever since she revealed her bloodline, her true connection to the Triads. She had promised him that together they would dismantle the dragon's empire from the inside. But even as she spoke, there was a shadow behind her eyes, a glimmer of something Wei couldn't quite place. The hours passed like thick fog, and as the first light of dawn filtered through the cracks in the walls, Wei felt the weight of his decision bearing down on him. His trust in Mei Ling had always been unwavering, but now it seemed like everything was on the verge of crumbling. He had played the game of vengeance too long, and the pieces were shifting in ways he couldn't control. Just as he was about to voice his concerns, the door to their hideout creaked open, and there stood Lao Ming, the man who had haunted his every thought, the beast behind the Triad's brutality. His face was as hard as stone, his presence oppressive, like the storm before a downpour. Behind him, a handful of Lao Ming's enforcers stepped inside, their eyes scanning the room, sizing up Wei. Mei Ling. Lao Ming's voice was a low, menacing growl. "It's time." Wei stood up slowly, confusion and betrayal rushing through him like a current. Mei Ling had moved, her eyes locked on Lao Ming, her expression unreadable. For a brief moment, she hesitated, the softest flicker of doubt crossing her face before she turned to face Wei. "I'm sorry, Wei," she said, her voice cold and almost indifferent. But this was always the plan. The words hit Wei like a physical blow. His chest tightened, his pulse racing as the truth sank in. Mei Ling, the woman he had trusted with his life, had betrayed him. She had never been on his side, not really. She had played him, used him as a pawn in her own game of power. And now the Triads were here to finish what they had started. Wei's mind screamed, but his body reacted before he could process the full scope of her betrayal. His hand went to his blade, but it was too late. Lao Ming's men were already closing in, their weapons drawn, the cold gleam of steel catching the dim light. Wei's chest tightened as he felt the full weight of the trap he had fallen into. Mei Ling stepped toward him, her lips curling into a sad smile. "You were a means to an end, Wei. The Triads are my birthright, and Lao Ming will help me claim what's mine." "Why?" Wei spat, his voice thick with rage and disbelief. "After everything we've been through?" She shrugged, her gaze never wavering from his. "Power is a force stronger than loyalty. And you were never meant to be part of the future I'm building." In that instant, Wei understood. She had always been playing a different game. A game he had never been meant to win. Lao Ming's laugh echoed through the room. "It's time for the dragon to rise again." And with that, the walls closed in on him. The betrayal stung deeper than any wound, and as the cold metal of Lao Ming's men pressed in, Wei knew that everything he had fought for, the revenge, the blood, the power, had all been for nothing. Mei Ling had won. Wei's footsteps echoed in the dark, narrow hallway beneath the Triad headquarters. The air was damp and heavy, thick with the scent of old stone and lingering smoke. The building above him was alive with the hustle of the Triads, their music, their laughter, their ever-present power. But here, deep in the bowels of the structure, all was silent. A cold, oppressive silence that seemed to wrap around him, drawing him deeper into the heart of the beast. He had been led here by whispers, ancient rumors that spoke of a place forgotten by time, hidden from all but those who knew the Triad's deepest secrets. The dragon's heart, an artifact so potent that its very existence had been denied for centuries. It was said to hold the power of immortality, a relic of the first emperor of the Triads, forged in blood and sacrifice. Wei's hand rested on the rough, cold stone walls as he navigated through the winding corridors, each turn more deliberate than the last. He had come this far, passed through countless traps and hidden passageways, all in pursuit of the power that could change everything. The Triads had built their empire on lies, on brutality, on a history wrapped in legend and myth. But now, at last, He was about to uncover the truth. Finally, after what felt like an eternity, he reached the chamber. The door was heavy, old, its wood cracked and worn by centuries of disuse. He pushed it open slowly, the sound of the hinges scraping against the stone, feeling like a violation of some ancient peace. Inside, the room was lit by an eerie, flickering light that seemed to come from nowhere and everywhere at once. The walls were adorned with intricate carvings of dragons, their eyes gleaming with a fire that seemed alive. In the center of the room stood a pedestal, atop which lay a stone box. It was small, unassuming, but there was no mistaking the weight of its presence. Wei approached it cautiously, his breath steady but shallow, his fingers tingling with anticipation. This was it, the heart of the Triads, the key to everything he had sought, everything he had fought for. He opened the box with trembling hands, and inside, nestled in a bed of black velvet, lay the dragon's heart. It was a smooth, blood-red stone, pulsing with an energy that made the hairs on the back of his neck stand up. The air around it shimmered with power, and for a moment, Wei felt as though he could hear the whispers of the past, the first Triad leaders, their voices melding with the pulse of the stone, calling out for something greater. Wei reached out, his fingers brushing the stone. The moment his skin made contact, a jolt of heat shot through him, burning like fire. It was not pain, not yet, but the sensation was unmistakable. The dragon's heart had chosen him. He could feel its power coursing through him, its ancient energy filling the empty spaces in his soul, whispering promises of eternity. But at that moment, Wei knew there was no turning back. The dragon's heart was his now, and with it, the Triad's dark legacy. The price of immortality had always been high, but he would pay it. He would seize the power, no matter the cost. As he closed the box and lifted it from the pedestal, the chamber seemed to grow colder. The silence returned, heavier than before, and somewhere, deep within the walls of the Triad headquarters, the dragon stirred. The streets of Hong Kong simmered with a quiet tension, the usual hum of city life now tainted with a sense of impending doom. In the shadowed alleys and hidden corners of the city, whispers of the dragon's heart spread like wildfire. The artifact's power was undeniable, and with it, whoever possessed it could reshape the future of the Triad Empire. But for Wei, its weight was becoming unbearable, a constant reminder that the path he had chosen came with a price he had yet to fully understand. Lao Ming wasted no time. The moment the heart vanished, he unleashed a fury that no one had ever seen before. Triad operatives flooded the streets, scouring every building, every face, every shadow for Wei and the artifact. The once vast empire that Lao Ming had ruled with cold precision was now at the mercy of a single man. The hunt was on, and it was relentless. Wei had expected this. He knew the Triads would come for him. They would stop at nothing to reclaim the heart, to ensure their supremacy. But even as the city trembled under the weight of the Triads' wrath, Wei found himself standing on the precipice of something far darker than he had ever imagined. The heart had begun to change him. It was no longer just an artifact. It was a presence, an unrelenting force that whispered its demands into his mind, urging him toward something greater. But at what cost? He moved swiftly, shadows becoming his only ally. Mei Ling, his one-time confidant, was now a ghost in the streets too. Their alliance had been shattered, but there were no more choices. Only survival. He knew she would not betray him, not again. But even with her help, Wei could feel the Triads closing in on him, tightening their grip around his throat. Every moment now felt like an eternity. Each step he took echoed in his mind, each breath sharper than the last. The dragon's heart pulsed in his pocket, its power whispering promises of immortality, of revenge. But Wei was not foolish enough to believe that power came without consequence. As much as he had sought this moment, As much as he had longed for vengeance, he now realized the true price of power. It was more than just the Triads' fury. It was the weight of destiny. The heart had chosen him, but it had not given him control. It was an unyielding master, and Wei was merely its servant. The streets were growing quieter now, but that didn't bring him peace. Every shadow seemed to hold a threat, every flicker of light a potential betrayal. He could feel it in his bones. The Triads were coming, and they would not stop until the heart was back in their hands. Until he was dead. Wei pressed forward, his mind racing, the price of his ambition sinking in deeper. In the end, it wasn't just the Triads he had to fear. It was the heart itself. Wei sat in the dim light of a derelict building, his fingers tracing the edges of the dragon's heart. The room was eerily silent, save for the faint hum of the city far below, but his mind was far from still. Since the moment he had taken the artifact, his world had fractured into a series of jagged visions. It was as if the heart had awakened something deep within him, something ancient, malevolent, and beyond his control. At first, it had been fleeting, a flash of a dragon's eye in the darkness, a whisper in a language he could not understand. But as the hours stretched on, the visions became more vivid, more real. He could see the rise of the Triad Empire, the first emperor swearing loyalty to the dragon, blood spilled in the name of power. He could hear the cries of those who had died for the heart, their voices echoing in his head, tormenting him. The heart, it seemed, was more than just a relic. It was a curse, a prison that bound its possessor to a destiny of eternal suffering. His head throbbed as he pressed his palms to his temples, trying to shut out the visions, but they came regardless. He saw himself as a young man again, standing in front of the ruins of his family, feeling the heat of the flames that had consumed his life. And then, a shift. He was older, stronger, the heart in his hand, but the fire was still there, burning everything around him. The vision distorted, and in the flames, he saw Lao Ming, the face twisted in agony, his body burning like the rest of them. The heart was giving him power, but at a cost. Wei could feel the weight of it pressing on him, an invisible chain around his chest that pulled tighter with every passing second. The power was intoxicating, yes, but each moment he held the heart brought him closer to the abyss. He was no longer sure if the visions were warnings or merely the torment of those who had sought the heart before him. All he knew was that the curse of the dragon was now his to bear. He had once thought of power as a means to an end, revenge on the Triads, reclaiming what was his. But now, the price of that ambition was becoming clear. The heart had transformed him. He was no longer just a man with a vendetta. He was a vessel for the dragon's rage, and that rage would consume him, just as it had consumed those who had come before. The power coursing through his veins was a reminder, a constant presence that would never let him rest. In that moment, Wei understood the curse. The heart was not just a tool of vengeance, it was a prison, and he was trapped within it, bound to the same fate that had claimed every previous holder. No matter how far he ran, no matter how many battles he fought, the dragon would always be there, in his mind, in his heart, tormenting him until the end of his days. Wei had no choice but to leave the city behind. The weight of the dragon's heart, both physical and spiritual, had grown unbearable, each passing hour warping his mind further. The visions had become relentless, a torrent of ancient fury clawing at the edges of his consciousness. He had to find answers, something to make sense of the curse that now clung to him like a second skin. Guided by fragmented memories and whispers from old allies, Wei made his way into the mountains. The air was thin, and the further he climbed, the more distant the world below felt. The roads became fewer, the trees denser, until finally, there was nothing but jagged cliffs and mist that curled like the tail of a dragon. It was here, hidden in the shadows of the mountains, where the ancient secrets of the Triads were said to lie. The temple was not marked on any map, and its location was a myth known only to a select few. Wei had spent years searching for this place, and now, in the quiet solitude of the mountain peak, he found himself standing before it. The structure was carved from the very rock itself, its stone walls darkened by centuries of weather. The air around it was thick with an unnatural stillness, as if the world itself held its breath. He approached with caution, feeling the pulse of the dragon's heart against his chest. It was as if the temple itself recognized the presence of the artifact. Inside, the walls were covered in ancient murals, their colors faded but still vibrant in places. Dragons coiled around pillars, their eyes glowing with a fire that seemed to flicker within Wei's own soul. At the center of the temple stood a stone altar, where a single artifact rested, one far older than the dragon's heart itself. It was a dragon-shaped dagger, its blade forged from a metal that gleamed like nothing Wei had ever seen. As Wei stepped forward, a voice echoed through the chamber. It was not a sound, but a presence, deep within him. The Triads had never truly understood what they had inherited, the voice seemed to say. The dragon's heart was not a symbol of power. It was a curse, a means of control. The Triads had long ago made a pact with an ancient dragon clan, binding themselves to their legacy. The heart was the price they had paid. Wei's heart raced as the truth began to unravel. The Triads were not just a criminal syndicate. They were the descendants of a lost dynasty, one that had once ruled with the blessing of the ancient dragons. The empire they had built was founded on blood, betrayal, and the promise of immortality. The heart, Wei realized, was the key to that immortality, a gift from the dragons, but one that carried with it a terrible cost. As the realization settled in, Wei felt the weight of his mission shift, his revenge, his quest for power. It was all a reflection of a much older story, one that had been written long before his family's fall. The Triads were merely puppets in a game that stretched back to the dawn of time, and now he was caught in its tangled threads. The answers he sought were here, hidden in the temple, but the question remained. Could he break the curse before it consumed him, or would he too become a part of the ancient myth? Wei stood at the precipice of everything. The winds howled through the mountains, carrying with them the bitter taste of what was to come. Below, the city of Hong Kong sprawled like a tangled web, its lights flickering in the night like distant stars. But the city, with all its power and illusion of control, was nothing compared to what lay ahead. The storm that had been gathering in his chest, a storm fueled by anger, betrayal, and the curse of the dragon's heart, was finally reaching its peak. He had learned enough in the mountains to understand the full scope of the battle he now faced. Lao Ming, the man who had destroyed his family, was no longer just a rival. He was the embodiment of everything Wei had fought against the dark side of the Triads, the corruption, the blood-soaked legacy of the ancient dragon kings. But Wei was not alone. Mei Ling, the woman whose betrayal had scarred him, stood at his side once more, though the weight of her past actions hung heavily between them. She had come to him in the darkness, her allegiance uncertain but her resolve clear. She was ready to reclaim the power she had once sought, to take the seat at the head of the Triads that had been denied her. And this time, she would stand with Wei, or fall by his side. With her, and a handful of trusted mercenaries, Wei had begun to form his alliance. Some were former members of rival gangs, others were disgraced warriors, all with their own reasons for standing against Lao Ming. But in the end, they all shared one thing in common: the desire to see the Triads brought to their knees, to end the reign of terror that had cast a shadow over Hong Kong for too long. The storm in the sky matched the one raging within Wei. The time for preparation was over. The final confrontation was close, and there was no turning back. His heart, heavy with the knowledge of what was at stake, pounded in his chest. Honor, revenge, and the legacy of his family. All of it had led him to this moment. Lao Ming had made his move, but Wei was ready to take the next. His mind raced through the plan. The Triads' headquarters, the fortress built on the bones of their ancestors, would be the battlefield. Inside those walls, Wei would face Lao Ming, but more than that, he would face the very essence of the Triads: greed, power, and the weight of a history that had never been truly understood. The stakes had never been higher. The storm had broken. But this battle was not just a clash of warriors. It was the final reckoning between the old world of dragons and the new. Wei, standing tall against the wind, could feel it in his bones. The Triads' empire would fall, or it would burn with him at its heart. The gathering storm was not just the beginning of the end, it was the end of an age. The moon hung low over the city, casting a pale, haunting glow on the streets below. The air was thick with tension, and the scent of rain lingered in the air, as if nature itself was holding its breath. Wei stood at the edge of the battlefield, his heart thundering in his chest, his grip tight on the hilt of the legendary sword. Tonight, the Triads would face their reckoning. It began in the shadows, with a roar that split the night, a signal from the mercenaries, and the first wave of fighters surged forward. Wei's heart beat in rhythm with the drums of war, a sound that reverberated through the alleyways of Hong Kong. On the other side, Lao Ming's warriors, hulking men with dragon tattoos that marked their loyalty, rushed to meet them, their eyes burning with a mixture of rage and fear. The Triads knew this battle would determine everything. Their empire, their myth, would either crumble or be reforged in blood. The clash was immediate. Steel scraped against steel, the sounds of battle ringing out as Wei's allies engaged the first wave of Triad warriors. The air crackled with violence. Punches were thrown, knives slashed through the air, and the roar of gunfire echoed down the narrow streets. But the true battle was always meant to be between Wei and Lao Ming. And as the first of Lao Ming's men fell beneath the weight of Wei's sword, the final confrontation became inevitable. Lao Ming's voice cut through the chaos, a guttural roar filled with hatred. "You should have stayed dead, Wei Chao." His words were thick with venom, and the ground beneath them seemed to tremble as he stepped forward, his massive form cutting through the smoke and dust of the battlefield. Wei didn't flinch. He didn't need to. The sword he held was no mere weapon, it was the key to his vengeance, and the embodiment of everything he had fought for. With a single, fluid movement, he met Lao Ming head-on. The clash of their swords was like the crash of thunder, the steel biting into each other with such force that sparks flew into the night. The Triad leader's strength was unmatched, his every move fueled by years of ruthlessness. But Wei, driven by the desire to reclaim his family's honor and punish those who had betrayed him, was faster. His sword danced through the air with a grace and power that made the ground beneath them tremble. Every strike was a reminder of the pain he had endured, of the rage that had been building within him for years. As the battle raged on, it became clear that this was no longer a fight for survival. It was a fight for legacy, for the soul of the Triads themselves. The street was a battlefield of blood and fury, but amidst the violence, Wei and Lao Ming were locked in a deadly dance, their swords a blur as they fought for supremacy. The Triads' once mighty empire was crumbling before their eyes. Blood stained the ground, and the sound of battle was drowned out by the unrelenting fury of the clash between the two men. And as the night wore on, the outcome seemed inevitable. One of them would fall. The air was thick with the weight of history, the smell of blood mingling with the salty tang of sweat. Wei stood before Lao Ming, his sword still humming with the power of battle. His chest heaved with exertion, but there was no relief, only the final reckoning. The Triad leader's eyes burned with fury, but even through the haze of anger, Wei could see something else. Fear. Fear of the unknown. Fear of the truth that had been buried for too long. Lao Ming was a giant of a man, his dragon tattoo twisted and warped on his chest, pulsing with an energy that seemed unnatural. His presence was like a storm, his every movement calculated and brutal. He lunged at Wei, his sword crashing down with a force that could shatter stone. Wei blocked, the clang of their blades reverberating through the silent streets, but Lao Ming was relentless. He struck again and again, each blow a hammer, each step forward a claim on the empire he had spent years building. Wei was faster though, his movements a blur as he dodged and parried. His body was aching, every muscle screaming in protest, but his resolve was unbreakable. He could feel it now, the end was near. Not just for Lao Ming, but for everything the Triads had built. The lies, the blood, the betrayal. The fight stretched on, neither man yielding, neither man giving an inch. Lao Ming's rage was palpable, but Wei had something stronger: vengeance. The power of 1,000 broken promises surged through him. With a roar, Wei spun, his blade finding its mark in Lao Ming's side. The Triad leader staggered back, his breath ragged, his eyes widening in disbelief. He clutched at the wound, but his strength was already faltering. "You think you've won?" Lao Ming spat, blood trickling from the corner of his mouth. "You have no idea what you're fighting for." Wei stepped closer, his eyes locked onto Lao Ming's, the weight of his words hanging in the air. "I've fought for my family, for the truth." Lao Ming's lips curled into a bitter smile, even as he crumpled to the ground, his sword falling from his hand. "You're not the first to seek revenge, Wei, but you've been chasing shadows, chasing a myth. You don't even know who the Dragon King truly is. You don't know the truth behind your family's destruction." The words hung in the air like a curse, and for a moment, Wei's breath caught in his throat. Lao Ming's smile faded, and his body slumped, the life leaving his eyes. But his last words echoed in Wei's mind like a drumbeat, a warning he couldn't ignore. The Triad leader was dead. His body lay still in the blood-soaked streets, but Wei's heart raced. The truth was just out of reach, tantalizing and maddening. There was something more, something deeper than the vengeance he had sought. The game had shifted, and now Wei would have to face the truth that had been hidden from him for so long. The death of Lao Ming sent ripples through the underworld, but they weren't the kind of waves that offered peace. As Wei stood over the body of the man who had been his greatest enemy, a new storm began to stir. The Triads were a machine built on power, and with Lao Ming's fall, the gears ground to a halt, only to start turning in a different direction. Wei had always known this moment would come, but the weight of it still pressed down on him like a mountain. He had killed the man who had destroyed his family, but now he found himself standing at the precipice of something far greater than vengeance. The title of Dragon King was not a crown but a curse, a mantle he had never wanted, yet one he could no longer deny. The streets of Hong Kong, once ruled by fear, now called to him, and the power of the Triads surged around him like an unstoppable tide. But power was never without its price. The factions within the Triads' ranks had begun to stir, like snakes uncurling from the shadows. They were watching, waiting for the opportunity to strike. Lao Ming's death had left a vacuum, and every leader, every loyalist, had a claim on the throne. Wei knew that to hold on to what he had taken, he would need more than just bloodshed. He would need strategy, he would need alliances, and above all, he would need to navigate the treacherous waters of ambition that ran deeper than any bloodline. The first to make their move were the old guard, men who had served under Lao Ming but had kept their loyalty buried beneath layers of calculation. They appeared before Wei with empty smiles, masked with respect, offering their allegiance in exchange for favors, positions, and power. But Wei saw through the facade. He had learned the truth about betrayal long ago, and he wasn't about to let himself be a pawn in someone else's game. Yet there were others, factions even more dangerous. Rival families, some from outside the city, saw Wei's rise as an invitation, an opening for their own interests. They began to move their pieces on the board: arms shipments, drug routes, territory in the heart of the city. Their whispers echoed through the night, and Wei knew that he couldn't just wait for the storm to pass. The Dragon King was no longer a name. It was a battlefield, and Wei was now its unwilling general. His rise had been swift, but the stakes had only grown higher. Each step forward meant more enemies, more pressure, and more lives at risk. The Triads had thrived on chaos, and now Wei would have to master it or become its next victim. The world of shadows he had entered was unforgiving. The dragon's rise was not a path paved with glory, it was a fight for survival, one that Wei knew he could no longer fight alone. Wei stood in the heart of the Triad headquarters, staring at the men around him, old faces, familiar, but now looking more like ghosts than allies. The weight of Lao Ming's death still lingered in the air, heavy like smoke. He had inherited an empire built on corruption, bloodshed, and fear, and yet, in his heart, Wei felt a pull toward something different, a desire to restore the honor his family had lost and reshape the Triads into something better. It was a dream, perhaps, a naive one, but it was all he had left. The streets of Hong Kong had witnessed enough carnage. He saw it in every corner of the city, in the eyes of its people, in the stories whispered in alleys. The Triads had once been more than just a criminal syndicate. They had been protectors, warriors of tradition. Now they were a machine of greed, driven by ruthless ambition. Wei knew he couldn't change everything in a moment, but he could start with small steps, with the choices he made, with the men he surrounded himself with. He gathered his inner circle, trusted men and women who had known the old ways but who also saw the world differently. Together, they began to rebuild, taking stock of what had been lost and what could be salvaged. The first change was subtle, a shift from blind loyalty to something more earned, more personal. The idea of honor was woven into every decision. Money would no longer be the sole motivator. Wei sought to inspire something greater, a sense of duty, a desire to protect the city and its people, not just profit from their misery. But old habits died hard. The deeper Wei delved into the inner workings of the Triad Empire, the more he realized that the very culture he sought to change was like an entrenched disease. Corruption ran through its veins, from the top to the bottom. The businessmen who supplied the drugs, the politicians who turned a blind eye, the street soldiers who had been born into this life, they were all tied to the legacy of the Triads in ways Wei could not sever. There were too many fingers in the pie, too many dark corners where greed festered, where trust was a currency far less valuable than betrayal. He found himself caught between two worlds, the dream of redemption and the harsh reality of the empire he had inherited. Every time he attempted to implement reforms, to install systems of justice, he was met with resistance. His closest allies, the ones who had supported him, were themselves products of the old ways. They spoke of loyalty, but loyalty to what? To a system that bred fear, or to the man who was trying to reshape it? Wei began to understand that his battle was not only against the Triad's enemies, but also against the Empire's own nature. It would take more than just one man to cleanse the darkness. He was no longer fighting for revenge alone. He was fighting for the future, for a chance to forge a legacy worthy of the dragon's name. But as the days wore on, Wei felt the walls closing in. The Triad culture that had been built over centuries was not easily undone. The truth was, Wei couldn't escape it. The legacy of the dragon was too ingrained in the bloodlines, the traditions, the streets of Hong Kong. And though he had hoped to rewrite that history, he began to wonder if he could truly outrun it, or if, in the end, it would consume him as it had all the others before him. Wei stood at the edge of the towering skyscraper overlooking the city below. The lights flickered in the distance, casting an eerie glow on the streets that had once been ruled by fear and blood. His thoughts were consumed by the prophecy that had surfaced like a ghost from the past, a whisper that seemed to follow him wherever he went. The old sages had spoken of it in hushed tones, an ancient vision foretelling the rise of a new dragon king, a leader who would either bring about a golden age for the Triads or, with a single misstep, destroy everything they had built. The weight of the prophecy hung heavy on his shoulders. It felt like a sentence, a decision he had yet to make. The Triads, for all their power and influence, were a fractured empire. Their legacy was as much about destruction as it was about control. Could he, a man who had once sought nothing more than revenge, truly lead them into a new era? Or would his attempt to reshape them only hasten their fall? His mind raced, torn between the two paths before him. Redemption, the dream he had held onto for so long, seemed almost within his grasp. A chance to right the wrongs of the past, to cleanse the Triads of the corruption that had tainted their soul for generations. But even as he entertained the idea, doubt crept in. He had seen firsthand how deeply the empire was embedded in the fabric of Hong Kong. To tear down the old ways would require more than just a change of heart. It would mean uprooting everything, destroying the very foundation upon which the Triads had built their empire. Destruction, the other side of the prophecy. It was not a path he had wanted to walk, but the longer he stayed in power, the more the temptation gnawed at him. The Triads had survived on chaos, on bloodshed. Perhaps, he thought bitterly, the empire was beyond saving. The truth was, there was something seductive about the idea of bringing it all to an end, to burn it down and let the ashes scatter in the wind. But no matter how he turned the prophecy over in his mind, the choice was not simple. The Triads were not a machine that could be fixed with a few changes. They were a beast with many heads, and every attempt to tame them only seemed to make the monster more vicious. Wei had spent years fighting for control, for a chance to make things right. But as the prophecy lingered in his mind, he began to understand that perhaps the true test of leadership was not in redemption or destruction. It was in knowing when to fight, when to let go, and when to walk away. The dragon's call was not a command, but a warning. And it was one that Wei Chao had yet to answer. Wei stood in the shadow of the empire he had tried to rebuild. The city stretched before him, a maze of lights and sounds, both beautiful and corrupt. Beneath the surface, the Triads were changing. The once strong foundation of loyalty, honor, and fear was being slowly eroded by a new breed of gangsters. Young, hungry, and impatient, they had no memory of the old ways, no reverence for the traditions that had kept the Triads alive for centuries. They wanted power, and they wanted it now. They were everywhere on the streets, in the clubs, in the underground networks. Their faces were familiar, yet unfamiliar. They wore suits instead of tattoos, talked business rather than bloodshed, but beneath the veneer of modernity, they were driven by the same ruthless ambition that had shaped the empire long ago. And they weren't waiting for Wei. They were moving, plotting, scheming to take control for themselves. Wei watched from a distance as the young Triad leaders grew bolder. They weren't afraid of him. They had heard the stories, yes, but they saw him as a relic, an old dragon who had done his part and now simply stood in the way of their ascent. They didn't understand the sacrifices that had been made, the lives lost, the blood spilled to get the Triads to where they were now. To them, it was just business, a way to make money, to control, to dominate. But for Wei, it was always more than that. It had never just been about the empire, the power, the money. It was about redemption. It was about finding a way to rebuild something that could, one day, be proud of. But these new Triads, they were different. They cared only for the end game, and their methods were as dangerous as they were efficient. At a meeting with his closest allies, Wei felt the weight of the change. The faces around the table were older, weathered by years of war and betrayal. But their eyes, their spirits, were tired. They had done all they could. Now it was the next generation's turn, and the air between them was thick with tension. The young Triads had no respect, no sense of loyalty. They were fast, unpredictable, and already testing the boundaries Wei had fought so hard to establish. A young man named Zhang, a promising new leader among the younger generation, stood up and spoke. His words were sharp, his tone cold, as he challenged Wei's authority, daring to suggest that the empire could be better without the old guard. He was confident, too confident, and for a moment, Wei saw himself in the boy young, ambitious, and hungry for power. But there was something in Zhang's eyes that Wei could not ignore, a recklessness that would one day consume him. The new generation was rising, and Wei knew that his time was running out. The empire he had fought to preserve was slipping through his fingers, and the battle for control would soon be fought in blood once more. A storm was coming, one that would either tear everything down or force Wei to make a decision he had been avoiding for far too long. The question lingered. Could he save the Triads, or was it already too late? Wei stood alone on the balcony, looking out over the city he had spent his life building and destroying in equal measure. The skyline glittered, but to him, it was just a collection of cold glass and steel. The warmth of the empire he had once felt was gone, replaced by a cold, gnawing emptiness. His reign had been filled with battles, some fought with weapons, others with secrets, but now, as the weight of his decisions pressed down on him, it seemed as though everything was slipping through his fingers. The Triads were on the verge of collapse, torn apart from within by internal power struggles, betrayal, and the relentless ambition of the younger generation. The streets buzzed with whispers of revolt. The new blood, led by Zhang, was moving against him, their hunger for power growing with every passing day. But it wasn't just the enemies outside that Wei feared anymore. It was the ones he had trusted, the ones closest to him, who had begun to turn away. Mei Ling was the only one who had stayed by his side through it all. At first, her presence had been a comfort, a steadying force in the chaos. But now, as the walls closed in, her eyes had become distant, her smile forced. There was something she wasn't telling him. He could feel it, deep inside, gnawing at him. That night, Wei sought her out. He found her in the quiet of their hidden meeting room, her silhouette framed by the dim light from the candles flickering on the table. She didn't turn to face him at first, as if she had been expecting him, or perhaps hoping he wouldn't come. "What is it, Mei Ling?" Wei asked, his voice laced with exhaustion and a bitterness he could no longer hide. She didn't answer right away. The silence stretched between them, heavy with years of unspoken words. Finally, Mei Ling turned, her face pale but resolute. "You're right to fear them, Wei. The new generation, they want your throne, your empire. But there's something even darker at play here." Wei's heart skipped a beat. He stepped forward, a rush of anger rising in him. "What do you mean? Speak clearly, Mei Ling." She hesitated for a moment before her eyes met his. "It's your bloodline, Wei, your lineage. It's not what you think. You are not just a dragon king because of the legacy you've built. You are the descendant of the first emperor of the Triads, the real dragon king." Wei's breath caught in his chest. "What are you saying? I thought you—" "I knew," she interrupted softly, "but I didn't want to believe it. Not until now. But the truth is, Wei, your ancestors did not just lead the Triads, they enslaved the power of the ancient dragons, and that power has been passed down through your blood. You are cursed, just as they were. The very thing that gave the Triads their strength is the thing that will tear them and you apart." Wei felt the ground beneath him shift. He had always known the Triads' history was steeped in darkness, but this was a revelation too much to bear. He looked at Mei Ling, his heart torn between betrayal and disbelief. "Why didn't you tell me?" he whispered. I didn't want you to face the truth, she replied, her voice barely above a whisper. But now, it's too late. You've already begun the fall, and there's no way to stop it. Wei felt the room close in around him as Mei Ling's words settled like a stone in his chest. The shock was suffocating. His own bloodline, the lineage he had believed was his alone to carry, was a lie. For years, he had struggled, clawing his way to the top of the Triad Empire, thinking his victory was the result of his strength, his resolve. But now, with Mei Ling standing before him, her eyes hard and resolute, he understood the brutal truth. She wasn't just his ally. She wasn't even just a rival. She was his superior. Mei Ling, you're lying, Wei spat, his voice thick with disbelief. You're the last heir to the Dragon King? How could I not know? She shook her head slowly, the flicker of candlelight casting long shadows across her face. You were never meant to know, Wei. It wasn't your time to rule. You've been a pawn in a game much older than you can understand. His fists clenched at his sides, the rage bubbling up from a place he hadn't felt in years. He had trusted her. He had fought beside her, believed in the woman who had once been his lover, his confidant. Now, she was his undoing. Do you think you can just take it all from me? Wei growled. After everything I've done? After everything I've sacrificed? I never wanted this for you, Mei Ling replied, her voice cold, yet tinged with sorrow. But the empire you built, it's built on blood. The power you hold, it's not yours to keep. It never was. Wei's eyes burned with fury. He stepped toward her, his hand reaching for the sword by his side. Then let's settle it. You want the throne? You'll have to take it from me. Mei Ling's gaze darkened, and for a moment, there was a flicker of sadness in her eyes. But it vanished quickly, replaced by a fierce determination. Without a word, she drew the blade hidden at her side, a curved, ancient sword forged in the heart of the Triads' history. It gleamed in the dim light, its edge as sharp as the betrayal she had just laid before him. The two circled each other, neither speaking, the weight of their shared past hanging in the air like a storm ready to break. The flickering candlelight cast long shadows on the stone walls, but the tension between them was heavier than anything in the room. Wei's heart pounded in his chest, but his eyes never left her. The first strike came like a flash of lightning. Their blades clashed with a deafening noise, the sound of metal grinding against metal echoing in the stillness. Wei moved with precision, his years of training coming to the forefront, but Mei Ling matched him, her every movement a testament to her heritage. She was just as skilled, just as ruthless. The fight was brutal, each blow exchanged with the weight of their histories. Neither of them held back, the desperation of their battle filling the room with the sound of ringing steel. Sweat and blood mixed as they danced on the edge of destruction, both determined to come out on top. Wei's arms burned, his muscles screaming for release, but still, he pressed forward. He wouldn't lose. Not now, not after everything. But Mei Ling, relentless and unforgiving, was already thinking 2 steps ahead. With a swift, calculated movement, she disarmed him, sending his sword crashing to the floor. She stood over him, the blade pointed at his chest, her breath heavy, her face a mask of solemn finality. It's over, Wei, she whispered, her voice carrying both triumph and sorrow. The dragon's throne belongs to me. Wei sat in the darkness of his office, the weight of the empire he had built pressing down on him. The once thriving heart of the Triads now seemed a hollow shell, its pulse fading with each passing day. The walls, once adorned with the pride of his victories, were now cracked, covered in the dust of betrayal. His fingers tightened around the glass of whiskey in his hand, but the burn did nothing to numb the crushing realization that he had lost control. It started small, whispers in the shadows, rumors among his men. A few lost shipments here, a few failed deals there. He had dismissed them at first, trusting his instincts. believing that his leadership had been too strong, too undeniable to falter. But as days turned into weeks, the cracks widened. The factions within the Triads began to rise, rivals he had once defeated, now scheming to usurp him from the inside. It was no longer just an enemy he could see. It was in every corner, every handshake, every familiar face that no longer carried the same loyalty. His closest allies, the ones who had stood beside him through every battle, were the first to turn. First came Jin, his old friend, who had once bled for him in the streets of Hong Kong, now conspiring with those who wanted him gone. Then there was Shu, a trusted lieutenant who had always swore to follow Wei to the end. His betrayal was swift and brutal, like a snake striking at the heart of everything Wei had fought to protect. Each one had their reasons: greed, power, resentment, but for Wei, it all felt the same. It was a slow death, one that he had never prepared for. News reached him of attacks on his safe houses, men who had once sworn their loyalty now taking up arms against him. His empire, the one he had built from the ashes of his family's destruction, was crumbling under the weight of their disloyalty. The once proud symbol of the Triad was now a fractured, broken thing. Each piece, once held together by his will, was slipping through his fingers like sand. He could feel it now, the cold emptiness that had slowly crept into his bones, the inevitable decline of everything he had become. The Dragon King was falling. The legends, the power, the bloodshed, it all seemed meaningless in the face of the betrayal from those he trusted most. He could hear the echoes of his past failures whispering in the back of his mind, drowning out the sound of his own heartbeat. And then, as if the universe itself had decided it was time to deliver the final blow, Lao Ming's faction made their move. The battle came like a flood, overwhelming him, drowning him in a storm of betrayal. The streets that had once bent to his will now rejected him, leaving him exposed, helpless. Wei's eyes met the reflection of the man he used to be in the shattered glass of his office. A hollow, broken man the Dragon King reduced to dust. The fall of the dragon had begun. Wei stood alone in the center of the abandoned building, the weight of betrayal suffocating him. The dust of the Triad Empire lay thick around him, remnants of his past power scattered across the floor like discarded dreams. His mind raced, struggling to process the truth that had been laid bare before him. Mei Ling, the woman he had once trusted with his heart, the one who had stood by him through countless battles, had orchestrated the fall of everything he had fought to protect. All these years, he had believed her to be a loyal ally, a partner in his war against the corrupt forces that had stolen his family's legacy. But now, standing in the ruins of his empire, he saw her for what she truly was: a calculating force, hidden in the shadows, pulling the strings for her own gain. The betrayal had come slowly, quietly. It wasn't the type of betrayal that struck with a dagger in the dark. No, it was more insidious than that. Mei Ling had manipulated every move, every alliance, guiding him to the precipice, all the while knowing that she would be the one to claim the throne. Every decision, every risk he had taken, had been a step toward her own ascension. She had played the long game, her true intentions buried beneath layers of affection and loyalty. His breath came in shallow gasps as the pieces of the puzzle fell into place. The cryptic messages, the subtle gestures, the way she had always seemed to know his next move. She had been one step ahead of him the entire time, setting him up for the fall he never saw coming. And now, in this cold, empty room, she stood before him, her eyes gleaming with the same cold ambition that had always been hidden beneath her outward softness. "You knew, didn't you?" Wei's voice was raw, the words choking him as they left his lips. Mei Ling's lips curled into a smile, but it was a smile laced with poison. "I've always known what the Triads need," she said, her voice calm, steady. "And it's not you, Wei. You've become a relic of the past. Your empire was built on blood, but it was always destined to fall. I was the one who could shape the future. Wei clenched his fists, the anger boiling inside him. He had loved her. He had trusted her more than anyone. And now, as she stood there, her words cutting deeper than any blade, he realized that everything his family, his revenge, his life had been nothing more than a pawn in her grand design. "You've played me from the beginning," Wei said, the realization sinking in like a sharp blade. "And now, you want everything. The Triads, the legacy, the power." Mei Ling stepped closer, her presence suffocating, the weight of her ambition pressing down on him. "I was always meant to be the Dragon King, Wei. I just needed you to destroy what was left of it first." The final betrayal was complete, and now, Wei had nothing left but the cold, empty ruins of his dreams and the woman who had taken everything from him. Wei's steps echoed through the narrow alley, his breath ragged as the shadows of the city closed in around him. The weight of his betrayal, the collapse of everything he had fought for, pressed heavily on his chest. He had been running for days, never staying in one place long enough for the ghosts of his past to catch up with him. But tonight, as the rain began to fall in heavy sheets, the past found him. He stumbled into an abandoned warehouse, the scent of mildew and dust mixing with the biting cold of the night. The walls seemed to close in, and for the first time in years, Wei felt truly alone. He sank to his knees, the sound of the storm outside drowning out the thudding of his heart. The ghosts whispered in the silence. His mind drifted to the first time he had seen his family's compound, golden and radiant, a symbol of everything they had built, a place of power, respect, and legacy. A place that had once been full of life, now nothing more than a smoldering ruin. He could still hear the screams, the crackle of flames, the heat that had scorched his soul long before it had destroyed his home. His father's final words echoed in his mind. Protect the empire, honor the blood. But how could he honor the blood when it had been spilled for nothing? His father's death, his mother's screams, the way his sister's face had twisted with terror before it all ended in flames. These images played over and over, like a cruel film that he could not shut off. The Triads, his allies, the ones he thought would help him reclaim what had been taken, had abandoned him at every turn. And Mei Ling, the woman who had once shared his bed, now a symbol of his greatest betrayal, had been the final act in his destruction. As the storm outside raged on, Wei closed his eyes, the faces of the dead flashing before him, his father, his mother, his sister, all of them taken in the blink of an eye, and all of it because of the Triads, because of the very empire he had tried to rebuild. He had sought revenge, driven by the need to avenge the wrongs that had been done to him and his family. But now, with nothing left to fight for, revenge seemed like a hollow pursuit. The years of bloodshed, of sacrifice, now felt empty. What had it all been for? He had lost everything in his pursuit of power, and even now, with the remnants of his empire crumbling around him, he could not see the point of it all. The ghosts of his past laughed at him, mocking him for his futile quest, for believing that revenge could ever bring him peace. Wei stood slowly, the weight of his choices bearing down on him. The city seemed quieter now, the storm outside a distant echo. There was no more fight left in him. Only the ghosts remained, and even they were beginning to fade. Wei sat alone in the darkness, the weight of his decisions pressing down on him like 1,000 pounds of stone. The quiet of the night seemed unnatural, as though the world was holding its breath, waiting for the final act of a tragedy that had been years in the making. He had lost everything, his family, his empire, his honor, and now, as the shadows stretched long around him, he could feel the cold fingers of regret wrapping tighter around his heart. The echoes of the past swirled in his mind, the faces of those he had loved and lost, his father's stern gaze, his mother's warmth, his sister's laughter all gone. swallowed by the fire and blood of the Triads' betrayal. Wei had fought so hard to avenge them, to reclaim what had been taken from him, but in the end, what was left? Nothing but a crumbling empire, a legacy stained with too much blood. As the weight of it all bore down on him, Wei felt something shift within him, a flicker of clarity amidst the chaos. The Triads, this cursed empire, had consumed everything in its path: friends, enemies, families, and souls alike. But the cycle didn't have to continue. Not anymore. His hands trembled as he reached into his coat and pulled out the ancient dragon pendant that had once symbolized his claim to power. The symbol that had once meant control, vengeance, and rule now seemed like nothing more than a reminder of the destruction it had wrought. He held it in his palm, staring at it as though seeing it for the first time. The dragon had been a symbol of power, of strength, but it had also been a symbol of greed, of corruption. Perhaps it was time to let it go. Peace, Wei muttered to himself, the word strange on his tongue. He had never considered peace an option, not in the world he had been born into. But now, with everything lost, with the empire in ruins, peace seemed like the only possible redemption. He closed his eyes, the memories of his family, and the promises he had failed to keep flashing before him. The Triads had taken everything from him, but they had also shown him what he did not want to become, what he would never allow future generations to be. With a deep breath, Wei made his final decision. He would leave behind a legacy, but not one of power, not one of bloodshed. He would leave behind a legacy of peace, if only they could survive the chaos of the present. A legacy for those who would come after him, a promise to the descendants of the Triads that they could choose a different path, a path of honor, of redemption. But for now, he was too tired. The world would have to wait. The streets of Hong Kong hummed with the familiar rhythm of life, but beneath the surface, an undercurrent of unease had begun to take root. The city, once a vibrant, chaotic tapestry of power and corruption, had become something else entirely, a ghost of its former self. Yet, in the quiet shadows, there was a stirring. A figure, cloaked in mystery, moved through the darkened alleys, a presence unnoticed by most but felt by those who knew to look. Wei's son, the boy who had been lost to him long ago, the child who should have never known the darkness of the world his father had built. He had grown in the shadows, hidden away from the chaos, but now, like his father before him, he had returned. His footsteps echoed against the wet pavement, his eyes sharp, scanning the horizon. He was a man now, shaped by the weight of his lineage, though the world would never know the true story of what had happened to him. He had inherited more than just Wei's name. He had inherited his legacy, his blood, and a hunger for something that had been lost. But the Triads, the same force that had torn his family apart, had not changed. They were still lurking in the corners of the world, their hands reaching into everything, twisting every opportunity into something dark and dangerous. The boy now, a man, carried with him not just the memories of a father he barely knew, but a sense of duty. His father had once promised peace, a world free from the violence and bloodshed that had defined their family's name. The idea had been pure, but the reality was something far more complicated. The Triads were more dangerous than ever before, and now it was his turn to face them. His footsteps led him to the remnants of the old empire. The buildings, once monuments to Wei's power, now stood in silence, their walls crumbling under the weight of the years. The city, too, had changed. People had forgotten, or perhaps they had chosen to forget. But he had not. The memory of his father's name still echoed in the streets, a reminder of the empire that had once ruled. Wei's son walked into the heart of the Triads' territory, a place where blood had been spilled and lives lost. He didn't know what he was walking into, but he knew that it was time to reclaim what had been stolen. The dragon's legacy, his father's legacy, wasn't just about power. It was about more than revenge. It was about redemption, about rewriting the story that had been written for them long ago. The Triads, unaware of the figure in their midst, continued their games of power and manipulation. But soon, they would learn that the son of Wei Chao had returned, and with him, a storm. A storm that would challenge everything they had built, and in the end, reshape the future of the Triads forever. Wei's son stood in the shadow of the empire his father had built, a weight settling heavily on his shoulders. The streets of Hong Kong whispered his name before he even stepped into view. The Triads, once an entity of ruthless power and untold wealth, now seemed like nothing more than a broken machine, its gears rusted and its engines failing. But the power, the heart of it all, still beat somewhere deep within the underworld. His father had been the last true Dragon King, but now, as the son of that legacy, he stood on the precipice of something far greater. The new Dragon King, though not yet fully embraced, had begun to stir the embers of something powerful inside him. The blood that flowed through his veins carried more than just the weight of inheritance. It carried the lessons of pain, betrayal, and survival. His father had promised peace, a life beyond the endless cycles of violence that had plagued their family. But could peace be achieved in a world where power and influence were currency, and every corner of the world was soaked in blood? Wei's son spent long hours in the dead of night, hidden away from the eyes of the Triad, pondering the choices before him. He understood that power was not something one could simply command. It had to be earned, respected, feared. But he also knew that to lead the Triads into a new era, he would have to confront the very foundation on which they stood, the darkness that had built their empire in the first place. The dragon within him stirred. It was a symbol of power, yes, but it was also a curse. He felt its weight, the burning in his chest, a constant reminder of the legacy he carried. His father had carried the same fire, had been consumed by it. The choices had led to destruction, betrayal, and death. Could he do better? Could he find a way to rebuild without sacrificing everything? He thought of Mei Ling, of the truth she had revealed to him about his bloodline, and the prophecy that followed it. The Triads had always been about dominance, but what if there was another way? A way to rule, not with fear, but with something stronger, a code, a purpose that went beyond greed and power. But to follow this path, he would have to abandon everything his father had done. He would have to break free of the shackles that bound him to the past. As dawn began to rise over the city, casting light on the streets that had been stained by his family's actions, Wei's son knew that the time for choosing was upon him. To become the true Dragon King, he would need to master not just the power that flowed through him, but the will to break free from the mistakes of those who came before him. Only then could he awaken the dragon's true power and decide what kind of king he would truly become. Wei's son stood at the edge of the sprawling city, his gaze drifting over the neon-lit streets below. The weight of the empire felt heavier with each passing day. It wasn't just the Triads that now depended on him. It was the ghosts of his father's legacy, the haunting echoes of every battle fought, every life taken, every betrayal that had carved the path to this moment. He had always known that the cost of legacy was steep, but now, standing in his father's shadow, he could feel the true price of it settling like a stone in his chest. The streets of Hong Kong were alive, bustling with energy, but beneath that pulse, there was a tension, an undercurrent of fear, of violence waiting to erupt. The Triads had grown, expanded, become something unrecognizable, but in their growth, something essential had been lost. Greed had taken over, and honor was now a forgotten word, whispered only by those who had died long ago. The new Dragon King could feel that his people, those who still held to the old ways, were waiting for him to lead them. But how could he? How could he lead them to something different when the same blood ran through his veins, when his father's mistakes loomed so large? There were moments when the weight of what was asked of him became unbearable. The Triads had been founded on strength and fear, on loyalty forged in blood, but also on corruption. There was no escaping that truth. And now, as the new Dragon King, he had to make a choice: to follow in his father's footsteps and continue the cycle, or to rewrite it, to forge a path towards something better. But in this world, power never came without a price, and that price was always steep. He thought of his father's rise, of the man who had built an empire with blood and fire, a man who had sought revenge for his family's death, and in the end, had been consumed by it. The ghosts of those who had fallen under his father's rule haunted every corner of the city, and now, those same ghosts whispered in his ears. Could he truly break free of that cycle? Could he lead the Triads to something that wasn't built on the foundation of blood and revenge? As the days passed, Wei's son felt the pull of the past tightening around him. Every decision, every move he made, carried the weight of his father's choices. The legacy was no longer just a gift. It was a chain, a burden that kept him shackled to a future he wasn't sure he could escape. The price of legacy was clear. It was more than wealth, more than power. It was a life that could never be free, a life always watched, always hunted, always bound to the mistakes of those who came before. The question now was whether he could pay that price without losing everything he had left. Wei's son stood in the heart of the Triad's hidden lair, the hum of low voices and murmurs from his closest advisors echoing in the dimly lit room. The weight of the Dragon King title pressed upon him, like a 1,000-pound stone sinking into his chest, suffocating him with its expectations. He had always known that being the heir to the empire would come with challenges, but nothing prepared him for the sharp sting of holding a power built on bloodshed, betrayal, and destruction. The Triads were fractured, and as their new leader, he was expected to mend those fractures, to unite the factions that had turned against each other in the years since his father's downfall. But rebuilding was no simple task. The shadows of the past were long, and their reach was relentless. Some factions, loyal to his father's memory, clung to the old ways, the brutal, unforgiving strength that defined the Dragon Kings of old. But there were others, opportunists, who saw only a chance to exploit the power vacuum. They whispered promises of greater wealth, control, and influence, knowing that the young king was inexperienced, unsure of the path he needed to take. Wei's son paced the room, every decision weighing heavily on him. He had inherited his father's legacy, his name, his strength, his vision for the empire. But what was left after all the bloodshed? His father had burned every bridge, left every relationship twisted by lies. And now, the son was left with the ashes. How could he build something new when the foundations were rotten with corruption? His hand hovered over a map of Hong Kong. The city sprawled beneath his fingertips like a canvas of possibilities. He could feel the power surging within him, the same fire his father had once possessed, but it was tempered by the fear of becoming like him, of falling into the same traps that had consumed the man he had once admired. What if power, in the end, was nothing but a cycle, a chain that wrapped tighter with each generation? The advisors around him watched with quiet intensity, their gazes flicking to him as if waiting for a sign, an order, something to indicate which way he would take them. He had heard the stories of the Dragon King's wrath, the promise of a reign that would sweep all enemies aside, but that was not the path he wanted to walk. He wanted to rebuild, to offer his people a future that wasn't stained with blood. But how could he reform an empire that had thrived on fear? How could he change the very thing that had given him his power, when it was the same thing that now threatened to consume him? Wei's son clenched his fists, the grip tightening with the realization that he couldn't change everything, not all at once. But if he was to succeed, he would have to find a way to strike balance, to carve out a new path while navigating the dark waters of his heritage. The Dragon King title was his, whether he was ready for it or not. Wei's son sat alone in his private chamber, the faint flicker of candlelight casting long shadows against the walls. The weight of the Dragon King's title felt heavier than ever, a burden that threatened to crush him beneath its legacy. The past was never far, always lurking at the edges of his mind, whispering its judgments and demands. It had been weeks since he had first taken the throne, and yet every decision felt like a step into the darkness, unsure whether he was walking in his father's footsteps or forging a new path entirely. But tonight, the past seemed closer than ever. As he leaned over the map of Hong Kong spread across his desk, he could almost feel the presence of those who had come before him. His father, the great Wei Chao, the legendary Dragon King who had built an empire from blood and fire. And yet, for all his father's power, all the wealth and influence that had once flowed through the Triads, there was no peace. Only chaos, destruction, and a relentless pursuit of dominance that had ultimately led to their downfall. He could feel their eyes on him now. The ghosts of the Dragon Kings, each one with their own demands, their own expectations. The whispers of their failures, their betrayals, echoed in his mind. The room seemed to grow colder, the air thick with their presence. "You cannot escape what you are," a voice rasped from the shadows, low and familiar. He looked up sharply, but no one was there. It was his father's voice, as if it had come from the walls themselves. "This empire is built on blood, and no matter how you try to change it, you will always be one of us." The words sent a chill down his spine. He wanted to dismiss them, to believe that he could be different, that he could reshape the future of the Triads. But the truth was undeniable. The empire his father had left him was a beast, a creature that had been nurtured on greed and violence, and it could not simply be wished away. "You think you can lead them with honor?" The voice of another Dragon King interjected, this one colder, more cynical. "You're nothing but a tool, a puppet. They will use you, just like they used your father." The Triads do not care for ideals. They care for power. Wei's son closed his eyes, gripping the edge of the desk to steady himself. His father's empire was a monster, but it was also his inheritance, his birthright. The ghosts of the past would never allow him to forget that. And yet, in the darkness of the room, he found a flicker of resolve. He would not let the past define him. He would find a way to break the cycle, to build something new from the ashes. The ghosts of dragons past might haunt him, but they would not control him. His legacy was still his to write, and this time, he would write it on his own terms. Wei's son sat in the dim light of his office, his fingers tracing the edges of a map of Hong Kong that had been marked with various territories, red lines and circles that represented the reach of the Triads. For weeks now, reports had been trickling in, whispers of a new rival force, an organization that didn't play by the old rules, an organization that moved in the shadows, unseen, its methods subtle yet deadly. The Triads were a beast of brute force, power, and tradition. But these new enemies were ghosts, silent, elusive, and impossible to pin down. At first, he had dismissed it as another rumor, a threat invented by someone looking to test his resolve. But the reports kept coming, each more alarming than the last. Businesses were going under, high-profile members were disappearing without a trace, and entire neighborhoods fell under the grip of fear, their inhabitants unaware of what was happening until it was too late. Wei's son had tried to meet this new enemy head-on, using the Triads' tried-and-true methods: intimidation, violence, fear. But there were no faces to fight, no territory to seize. His men were attacked, and yet the assailants were never seen. No one knew who to target. No one knew where the threat came from. It was as if the enemy was everywhere, yet nowhere at all. It was a war fought without a single blow landed, a war of shadows and whispers. The enemy was everywhere and nowhere, watching, waiting, orchestrating their attacks with surgical precision. Every step forward seemed to draw Wei's son deeper into a labyrinth of unseen traps. His allies began to question him, their faith in his leadership beginning to erode. The Triads were founded on power, on strength, on dominance, and now here was an enemy who didn't care for power at all. They didn't want to fight in the open, didn't want to make their presence known. Instead, they manipulated, infiltrated, and struck from the shadows, pulling strings without ever revealing their hand. It was a style of warfare that Wei's son couldn't understand, a style that no one in the Triads had ever trained for. As the pressure mounted, Wei's son found himself haunted by the notion that this invisible enemy might be too powerful, too cunning for even the Triads to defeat. His empire was built on intimidation, on fear, but this new organization operated outside those confines. They had no need for thugs and muscle. They didn't need to show their power, they merely needed to plant the seeds of doubt, confusion, and paranoia. Sitting alone, the weight of his family's legacy pressing on him, Wei's son felt the walls closing in. He had always known the Triads would face challenges, but he had never imagined a war like this one without borders, without a face. And for the first time, he wasn't sure if the enemy could be defeated, or if they would simply fade into the shadows, leaving him and his empire to crumble in their wake. Wei's son stood in the heart of the city, under the cold glow of neon lights that bathed the streets in an eerie, artificial haze. For weeks, he had felt the tension in the air, the weight of impending conflict that hung like a storm cloud. He had learned the enemy's methods, understood their manipulation, but now it was time to face them. No more shadows, no more ghosts. He was done waiting for the unseen to strike. It was time to end this war. The rival organization had pushed him to the edge, drawn him into a game he never wanted to play. But tonight, he would make the final move. The leader of this elusive force had remained hidden, a phantom controlling the strings from a distance, but now the time had come to unmask him. In the silence of the night, Wei's son entered the abandoned warehouse, a place that had become a symbol of everything he had fought for and lost. The walls echoed with the memories of his ancestors, their voices calling to him from the past. He could feel them, their presence, urging him forward. This wasn't just a battle for control of the city. It was a battle for his legacy, for the very soul of the Triads. He was not just Wei's son. He was the Dragon King, the bloodline of power that ran through the veins of the Triads. And tonight, he would reclaim what was his. The dimly lit room was empty, save for the shadowy figure that stepped from the darkness, the leader, at last, revealed. A man whose face was both familiar and foreign, someone Wei's son had never met but whose influence had been felt in every corner of his empire. His eyes were cold, calculating, devoid of the fire that Wei's son had always carried. But there was something in his presence, an aura of calm that contrasted sharply with the chaos he had sown. "You've come," the man said, his voice smooth, almost inviting. "But you must know, this is your end." Wei's son didn't flinch. He stepped forward, every muscle in his body taut with the weight of his family's history, the legacy of the dragon. "This ends now," he said, his voice steady, unwavering. The leader smiled, but it was a smile devoid of warmth. "You think you can defeat me? You're just like your father, blinded by your legacy, unable to see the truth." For a moment, Wei's son felt a flicker of doubt. The ghosts of his ancestors whispered in his ear, but they weren't the ones who would decide his fate. It was his choice, his actions that would carve the future. With a swift movement, he drew the blade he had inherited, its steel gleaming in the low light. The final strike had come. The fight was swift, brutal, but it was clear from the first clash of steel that Wei's son was the one who would emerge victorious. With a final, decisive blow, the leader fell. The silence that followed was deafening. As the man's body slumped to the ground, Wei's son stood over him, breathing heavily, the weight of the battle lifting from his shoulders. The ghosts of the past no longer whispered in his ear. He had proven that the legacy of the dragon was his to carry. The Triads would not be destroyed. They would rise again, stronger than ever before. The air was thick with the smoke of burning ruins, the remnants of a war that had scarred the city beyond repair. Wei's son stood on the edge of the battlefield, eyes scanning the destruction, the echoes of gunfire still reverberating in his mind. The Triads had emerged victorious, but at what cost? Victory had come at the price of too many lives, and the price of his own soul seemed even heavier. He had fought with everything he had, his bloodline, his honor, his legacy, but now that the dust had settled, he found himself standing in the ruins of everything he had once believed in. The thrill of battle had faded, replaced by a hollow emptiness that gnawed at him. His hands, stained with blood, trembled not from exhaustion but from the weight of his choices. The battle had been the culmination of everything, the final confrontation with the rival organization, the ultimate fight for control. And yet, as the enemy lay defeated, Wei's son could only feel the weight of his lineage dragging him down. Revenge, once so sweet in his thoughts, had proven to be a poison. The enemy had been vanquished, but something deep inside him remained empty, a void that no victory could fill. He had watched his enemies fall, one by one, their blood spilling into the earth. But with each life taken, something inside him had died as well. He had tried to fill that emptiness with power, with vengeance, but now he realized it had only served to deepen it. He had become his father's legacy, but in the process, he had lost the man he once thought he could be. His father's teachings had always been clear. Strength, honor, and power were everything. But now, with his enemies gone and the empire under his control, he realized that power, no matter how great, could not heal the scars left on his soul. The city around him was still burning, but the flames no longer held any meaning. The destruction, once a symbol of his vengeance, now felt like a mirror of his own inner turmoil. He had sought justice, sought revenge for the wrongs done to his family, but in the end, he had become the very thing he had once despised: a tyrant, a killer, a man driven by rage and revenge. Wei's son turned away from the battlefield, the weight of the dragon's blood heavy on his shoulders. He had won the war, but he had lost himself in the process. There was no peace to be found in power, no comfort in revenge. All that remained was the bitter taste of regret, and the realization that the true battle, the one for his soul, was only just beginning. Wei's son stood at the precipice, looking out over the city that had been his father's kingdom and was now a shattered ruin. The Triads, once a vast empire built on fear and respect, had been broken beyond recognition. The streets that once thrived with the pulse of the underworld now lay in ruin, the echoes of gunfire and betrayal still lingering in the air. He had come to the top of the world, only to watch it crumble beneath his feet. Now, all he had were the fragments of a broken legacy. The weight of his lineage pressed on him like an iron chain, its cold grip tightening with every breath he took. He had inherited the title, the power, and the responsibilities, but now it all seemed like an illusion. His father's empire had been built on brutality, on bloodshed, on a ruthless pursuit of dominance. But what had it amounted to? A fractured kingdom, a trail of destruction, and a son who no longer knew if he wanted to follow in those footsteps. He had seen the cost of that power firsthand. Lives had been lost, friends, enemies, even his own sense of self. He had become a ruler, a man feared and revered, but he had also become a prisoner of the past, shackled to the legacy of a dragon that had once burned so brightly. Now that fire was a smoldering ash, its heat barely felt beneath the weight of his grief. The world was changing, shifting beneath his feet like a tide he couldn't control. The Triads were no longer the power they once were. The old ways were fading, replaced by new threats, new players, and new methods. The world outside the Triads' walls no longer ran on loyalty and fear. It ran on technology, on influence, on the subtle manipulation of markets and minds. The old ways of power had become obsolete, and with them, so too did the Triads' reign. Wei's son was faced with an impossible choice. To rebuild what had been lost would mean to return to the old ways, the ruthless, bloody methods that had led to his father's downfall. But to let go of the Triads would mean abandoning everything he had ever known, every ounce of his family's legacy. What would be left if he walked away from it all? The idea of starting anew, without the weight of the past dragging him down, was both a relief and a terror. As the sun began to set, casting long shadows over the city, Wei's son made a decision. He would not rebuild the Triads, not in the way they had once existed. The empire would not rise again from the ashes of greed and violence, but neither would he leave it all behind. There would be no escaping the legacy of the dragon, but perhaps there was a way to reshape it. A new path, a new future, one where the dragon could finally rest. But first, he had to break free from the brokenness his father had left behind. Wei's son stood in the quiet aftermath of his decision, the weight of the promise heavy on his shoulders. The night was still, but his mind raced, filled with thoughts of what had come before and what lay ahead. He had made his vow to rebuild the Triads, not in the image of his father's empire, but on a foundation of honor. It was a promise born from the ashes of the past, a desperate attempt to undo the damage, to heal the wounds that had festered for so long. But as he gazed out over the city, he knew the truth. The Triads were not a simple thing to rebuild. Power, once lost, was not easily reclaimed, especially when the world had moved on. The old enemies, the new bloods, and those who hungered for power at any cost, they would test him, push him, try to drag him back into the shadows where the Triads' true strength lay. And in the end, it would be a battle for something more than just power. It would be a fight for his soul. The Triads had been built on loyalty, yes, but it was a loyalty forged in blood, greed, and fear. How could he turn that into something noble? How could he shape something broken into something new? Every decision he made now would be scrutinized. Every step he took would be followed by eyes that saw opportunity, not redemption. His promise to rebuild on honor would be met with doubt, resistance, and betrayal. There would be those who did not want change. There would be those who wanted the power for themselves and would not allow him to redefine the old ways. As the cool night air brushed against his face, he felt a stir of doubt. Could one man, even one with the blood of a dragon king in his veins, truly change an entire system that had thrived for centuries on corruption and fear? Could he take the fractured remnants of the Triads and breathe life into them again? Or would he be consumed by the same hunger for power that had destroyed his father? The city stretched out before him, vast and silent, but he knew the storm was coming. His promise, though heartfelt, would not go unchallenged. He would face betrayal, yes, but also fierce loyalty from those who believed in him. And in those moments, in the face of overwhelming odds, he would have to decide. Classed, was he truly the Dragon King, the one who would lead his people to a new future? Or would he fall into the same trap as the generations before him? The road ahead was uncertain, fraught with peril, but Wei's son had made his choice. He would rebuild, no matter the cost. Honor would be the foundation, but only time would reveal if it could truly hold the weight of the dragon's legacy. The storm clouds hung heavy in the sky, a fitting reflection of the chaos that had engulfed Wei's son and the Triads. The city, once a place where his father's empire thrived, now felt like a cage, the walls closing in around him. His promise to rebuild was crumbling under the pressure of an unforgiving world. The new power, a shadowy organization that had risen with alarming speed, threatened to undo everything. They were swift, elusive, and without mercy, willing to burn the old ways to the ground in their pursuit of dominance. They had no respect for the history of the Triads, no understanding of the power of loyalty, or the weight of bloodshed that came with the territory. All they saw was an opportunity to take what they wanted. Wei's son stood at the edge of the rooftop, the wind carrying the scent of rain. His eyes narrowed as he looked out over the city he was sworn to protect. The Triads had fought wars, been toppled, and risen again. They had endured countless betrayals, but this new enemy was different. They were not bound by the rules of honor, and their influence spread quickly, infiltrating even the highest ranks of society. His Triads were fractured, weakened by internal struggles, and now faced with the terrifying prospect of being wiped out entirely. The weight of his father's legacy hung heavy on him, but it was more than that. He could feel the pull of something deeper, the ancient blood of the Dragon King urging him forward. But the question remained: should he lead his people into battle once more, risk everything to maintain the power his father had built, or should he be the one to end the cycle of violence once and for all? The Triads had been built on revenge, on power, on dominance. But at what cost? Each battle left a scar. Each victory only deepened the wounds. Was this the legacy he wanted to uphold? Could he change the course of history? Or was he destined to fall into the same trap as his father, perpetuating the endless cycle of bloodshed and betrayal? The choice was his, but it wasn't simple. To lead meant facing a war that could very well end in his death, or the destruction of everything he had worked to rebuild. To walk away, to find another way, would be seen as weakness, an abdication of the power that had defined the Triads for centuries. Wei's son closed his eyes for a moment, feeling the weight of his ancestors on his shoulders. The storm was coming, but this time, it wasn't just a battle for power. It was a battle for the soul of the Triads, for the future of the people who followed him. He could feel the pull of destiny in his blood, but he knew the decision before him would define everything. The cycle of violence had to end, but at what cost? And could he find the strength to break it? Or would he, like the generations before him, be swallowed by the dragon's flame? The dawn broke cold and unforgiving over the city, casting long shadows across the streets where the Triads had once ruled with unchallenged power. Wei's son stood in the center of it all, the weight of his decisions pressing down on him like a stone. The empire his father had built was no more, reshaped into something new, something he had tried to forge with his own hands, guided by honor, by the hope of redemption. But the scars of the past lingered in the air, like smoke that wouldn't dissipate. The Triads were different now, their structure fragile and uncertain. The foundations were there, but the cracks ran deep. He had done what he could to change the path, to move away from the blood-soaked history that had defined them for generations, but some things could never be undone. The ghosts of those who had fallen, of the men and women whose lives had been lost in pursuit of power, still haunted him. Every decision he made, every move he took, was shadowed by the choices of those who came before him. As he walked through the streets, past the old haunts, he could feel the eyes of the city on him, curious, questioning, waiting. The people wanted to believe that things had changed, that the bloodshed, the violence, the power struggles were behind them. But deep down, he knew the truth. The Triads had always been a force driven by greed, by ambition, by a thirst for control. Even with his reforms, even with his attempts to guide them onto a new path, the past was never far behind. There would always be those who sought to reclaim the old ways, to rise to power with the same ruthlessness that had built the empire. And so, he was left to pick up the pieces, to rebuild a legacy that had been tarnished by violence and betrayal. But as much as he tried to reshape the Triads, he knew that some things couldn't be erased. The blood that had been spilled, the families torn apart, the lives destroyed, they would always be part of the story, part of the legacy he carried. The new generation that looked to him for leadership would never know the full weight of what had come before them, but they would feel its echo. They would have to learn from the mistakes of the past, the ones that had led his father, and so many others, to their doom. His promise had been to create something better, to lead with honor instead of fear, but he was beginning to understand that there would always be a cost. There would always be a price to pay for the power, for the legacy of the dragon. The future was uncertain, but one thing was clear. The legacy of the dragon would never truly fade. It was in his blood, in his bones. The challenge now was to ensure that, in the end, it was a legacy worth remembering. A new day had risen over the city, but its light felt hollow. The streets, once thriving with the power of the Triads, now seemed to carry a heavy silence, as if holding their breath. In the midst of this quiet, Wei's son stood, the weight of his father's legacy pressing down on his shoulders. He had fought hard to reshape the Triads, to offer them a path toward redemption. The streets that had once echoed with the sounds of violence now hummed with the murmur of cautious hope, but with hope came doubt. He had promised peace, vowed to change the heart of the Triads, to guide them into a new era. Yet as he stood at the precipice of power, he realized that peace was not something easily achieved. The Triads were more than an organization. They were a force of nature, rooted in blood and betrayal, in ambition and greed. Could they ever truly be redeemed, or were they doomed to repeat their own cycle of rise and fall, of destruction and rebirth? The memories of his father's battles lingered in his mind, of the countless men and women lost, of the cost of revenge, of the price of power. Even with the reforms he had introduced, even with the new structure he had tried to build, there was a darkness that would not leave, a fire that had always burned deep within the Triads, ready to be reignited. The city's streets, once the battlegrounds of power, now carried a different kind of tension. Men whispered in the shadows, eyes darting nervously to see if their loyalty would be rewarded, if the promises of the new Dragon King would stand the test of time. But old habits die hard, and the temptation of power, once tasted, was never easy to forget. He knew there were those who still longed for the old ways, for the brutality and control that had defined the Triads for generations. They would wait for their moment to strike, to reclaim what they believed was theirs. Wei's son knew that, even as he fought for peace, he would be haunted by the question, could the Triads ever truly change? The promise of redemption hung in the air, but its weight was heavy, its future uncertain. For every step forward, there was the fear of being pulled back into the darkness. As the sun set on another day, he looked out over the city, knowing that the Triads would never truly be free of their past. The question would always remain, lingering like a shadow. Could the Triads, with their centuries of bloodshed and betrayal, ever truly find peace? Or would they forever be trapped in the cycle of their own making? The final dragon had risen, but whether it would fall again was a fate yet to be determined. The dawn broke over the city, a softer light than before, as if the streets themselves were waking from a long, painful dream. The Triads, for the first time in decades, existed not in the shadows, but in the daylight, their grip loosened, their presence tempered. Wei's son stood at the heart of it all, watching as the world shifted, a silent witness to the slow but undeniable change he had fought for. The peace he had promised was no longer a distant hope but a fragile reality. Gone were the days of constant violence, the betrayals that ripped families apart, the greed that fueled wars within their own ranks. The Triads had been restructured, reshaped into a force that, while still feared, now commanded respect more than terror. The blood-stained streets had quieted, replaced by quieter negotiations and careful alliances. It was a new era, one he had fought for, one he had bled for, but as peaceful as it seemed, the echoes of the past remained. The temptation of power was always there, lurking in the corners of his mind. He had seen it in his father's eyes, felt it in the weight of every decision. To lead was to carry a heavy burden, And while he had promised to carve a path of peace, he knew that peace was fragile. Beneath the surface, old rivalries simmered. The factions that had once competed for power, for control, did not simply vanish. They waited, biding their time, looking for cracks in the foundation he had built. He wondered, in quiet moments alone, if the Triads could ever truly be free from the shadow of their past. Could they survive without the fear and bloodshed that had once been their lifeblood? The old ways had defined them for so long, and even with his reforms, the temptation to return to them was ever present. The Triads had always been a beast of hunger, a machine that thrived on chaos. Could it learn to live in peace? Wei's son understood now that his victory had not been in the destruction of his enemies, but in the survival of what was left. He had reshaped the Triads, yes, but the real challenge was ensuring that they didn't fall into old habits, that the cycle of violence did not simply start again under a new name. It was a fight for the soul of the organization, a battle that would never truly end. As the sun set once more over the city, he felt a fleeting sense of peace, but it was tempered with the realization that peace, like power, was always fleeting. The Triads had been broken and rebuilt, but the question would always remain: could they live without the bloodshed? Could he, the last of the Dragon Kings, lead them into a future where the past was not a ghost that haunted them all? The years had passed, and the city now stood on the edge of a new era, its scars slowly healing. The streets, once drenched in blood and whispers of betrayal, had grown quieter. In the corners where shadows once clung to every alley, there was light now. A fragile peace had settled over the Triads, and with it, a sense of finality, an end to the cycle of violence that had defined them for so long. Wei's son had done what many thought impossible. He had taken the remnants of an empire built on power and fear and transformed it into something unrecognizable, something that, while still formidable, now adhered to a code of honor. He had broken the chains of the past, reshaped their legacy. Yet, even with all the changes, the world could never truly forget what had come before. The name of the Triads still carried weight, still drew fear in certain circles, but it was no longer synonymous with destruction. In his final days, Wei's son walked the streets of the city, observing the subtle changes he had fought for. The underworld had quieted, but it was not the same silence as before. This was the quiet of restraint, of choices made with careful thought, not the hush before the storm. He had led them away from the chaos, but he could never completely erase the mark the Triads had left on the world. He had come to understand that peace, like all things, was a fragile gift, but even in its fragility, there was strength. The Triads had endured for centuries, through wars and betrayals, their existence a testament to survival. And now, they had changed, not just in form but in spirit. His father's legacy, the fear that once consumed it, had been replaced with a more tempered rule. Power, as it turned out, was not about destruction, but about control, and not just over others, but over oneself. He knew that the Triads' legacy would never fade completely. History remembered the dragon, with all its fire and fury. But as the years passed, the world would remember the Triads not for their violence, but for the subtle shift that had occurred in their soul. The dragons of the past had been consumed by greed, by the endless hunger for power. But the dragon of the present, the one Wei's son had forged, was no longer driven by bloodlust. It was driven by something far more difficult to obtain: peace. As he stood in the heart of the city, looking out over the skyline that had once felt like a battlefield, he realized that his fight had never truly been about destroying the past. It had been about freeing them all from it. The Triads were not just an empire. They were a reflection of the world they inhabited. And now, as the world slowly turned, the story of the dragons was no longer one of blood and fire. It was one of redemption, of a new beginning. The dragon had found its end, and with it, a new story had begun. The last of the Triad leaders sat in the dimly lit room, the once imposing figures now hollowed by time and regret. The walls around them, once adorned with the banners of their power, had been stripped bare. The dragon was no longer the fierce symbol it had once been, but a memory slowly fading into the past. The empire, built on fear and bloodshed, had crumbled, and now they were left to ponder what it all meant. Wei's son had transformed the Triads, reshaping their legacy into something different, something quieter. Yet, as the world moved on, the remnants of the old guard remained, clutching onto the fragments of their once great power. There was no more talk of domination, no more whispers of hidden riches or brutal enforcement. The streets, once filled with the roar of the Triads' might, had fallen silent. For those who had lived through the glory days, the silence was deafening. They had fought, bled, and lost so much. They had been loyal to a cause that had promised them power, wealth, and respect. But now, in the waning light of their existence, they could only wonder if it had all been for nothing. The younger generation, the ones who had grown up in the shadow of the Triads' influence, had moved on, uninterested in the old ways. They were building their own world, one where the legacy of the dragon was nothing more than a cautionary tale. The few remaining members of the Triad, now old men, gathered at the table, their faces etched with lines of age and sorrow. The alcohol in their glasses reflected their somber mood, its golden liquid swirling like the memories of a time long gone. The air in the room felt heavy with the weight of what had been lost. The last breath of the dragon seemed to hang in the balance, slipping further away with each passing moment. "Did we do the right thing?" one of them asked, his voice hoarse, his hands trembling as he set his glass down. The others exchanged silent glances, their eyes betraying the uncertainty they had long kept hidden. They had once been the rulers of the underworld, feared and revered. Their empire had stretched its tendrils across borders, influencing governments, controlling the flow of money, and crushing any who dared challenge them. But now, in the quiet of their final days, the question of what it all meant consumed them. "We lived by the dragon's fire." Another spoke, his voice faint but resolute. "But we were never meant to survive it." The words hung in the air like a death sentence. The dragon had lived for centuries, but even the most powerful forces could not last forever. In the end, they had all been burned by their own ambition. And now, all that remained were these men, sitting in the twilight of their empire, reflecting on a time when they were unstoppable. The dragon had taken its last breath, and with it, the world they had once ruled slipped into history, never to return. The streets of Hong Kong had long since quieted. The neon lights, once symbols of power and influence, now flickered faintly in the distance, as if the city itself was remembering the ghosts of a time gone by. The Triads, once an unstoppable force, had become little more than a whispered legend, a story passed down through the generations like a warning, or perhaps a promise. The men who had once been the heart of the dragon's fire were gone, their names fading from the lips of those who had once feared them. In the shadows, the ghosts of the Triads still lingered, their presence a flicker in the corners of the city's vast skyline. Stories of their ruthlessness, their endless thirst for power, still floated through the streets, but they were no longer the truth. They were just the remnants of a forgotten empire, now consumed by time. Yet, as much as the Triads had fallen, they had never truly disappeared. Like a dragon whose flame had long since extinguished, their influence still breathed faintly in the air, hidden in the corners of the underworld. The younger generation, too busy chasing their own ambitions, had forgotten the lessons of the past. They had built new empires, new networks, but they could never fully escape the legacy left behind. In quiet back alleys, among the haze of cigarette smoke and the hum of idle chatter, the old men still met. They were the last ones who remembered the weight of the dragon's title, the taste of power that had once belonged to their families. They were no longer feared, but they still carried the stories, the whispered warnings of what had come before. To them, the Triads had never truly died. They were just dormant. But every so often, they would hear the echoes of the past, and they would remember. The legends still passed from one generation to the next, twisted by time into something greater than it had ever been. The dragon was no longer a symbol of terror. It was a myth, a shadow that loomed large over the present. In every flicker of neon, every whispered rumor, the Triads lived on. Some said the dragon would return, that the true heir would rise again and restore the empire to its former glory. Others said it was best left forgotten, that the power of the dragon could never be tamed again. As the city moved forward, it was haunted by the specter of its past. The ghost of the dragon still whispered in the hearts of those who remembered. And in the quietest moments, when the city paused to breathe, they could almost hear the roar of the dragon echoing from the depths of history, reminding them that empires are never truly gone. They simply fade, leaving behind the legend, the myth, and the ghosts of what once was. In the stillness of the night, the city of Hong Kong held its breath. Beneath the surface of its bustling streets and towering skyscrapers, there was a stirring, a shift, as if the past had not fully let go, and the future was uncertain. The whispers of the Triads, once a force that ruled with fear and reverence, had faded into myth. But in the quiet shadows, something new was beginning to rise. The old men, those who had been the last vestiges of the dragon's reign, no longer walked the streets. Their time had passed, their power gone. Yet, the legacy they left behind lingered. It was in the way the city moved, in the undercurrent of ambition that flowed through the veins of those who dared to dream of something more. It was in the new leaders who sought power not through fear, but through respect, through honor. A new generation had come to the forefront, ones who had not known the weight of the dragon's blood, but who understood its lessons nonetheless. They were not bound by the mistakes of their forefathers. They knew the dangers of power unchecked, of ambition without purpose. They were determined to forge a new path, one that would honor the old ways without repeating their failures. Among them was a figure, young and untested, but with a fire burning in their eyes. This new leader did not seek to reclaim the Triads' past glory. Instead, they sought to build a future where the cycle of violence and betrayal would no longer be the foundation of power. The world was changing, and so too was the way that power would be wielded. The streets that had once been marked by bloodshed and fear now whispered with the promise of something different. There was talk of alliances, not through violence but through shared purpose. The underworld, which had once been ruled by fear, began to shift towards something more constructive. The leader who now rose was not one who would rule with an iron fist, but with a steady hand. They would lead by example, showing that the true power of the dragon lay not in destruction, but in renewal. And so, the page turned. The cycle that had begun with fire and blood was now tempered with wisdom and hope. The legacy of the dragon was no longer a curse, but a blessing, one that would guide this new leader toward a future where honor, respect, and unity would define their reign. The echoes of the past still resonated, but they no longer held sway. As the first rays of dawn broke over the city, the dragon stirred again, not in the shadows of revenge, but in the light of a new beginning. The past was a lesson. The future was now in the hands of those who would shape it. The world had turned its final page, and in its place, a new chapter was born. The dragon had awakened, not in fury, but in peace.